Hello, everyone. I'm Mohamad Tavakoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. And I am also the professor for this course on the Iranian Revolution, and students who are presenting all were part of this course on the Iranian Revolution. And they have all come with brilliant presentation. For most of you, with one exception, most students are students of Iran or Afghanistan, have worked on research projects. And this is their preliminary presentation. And these hopefully will become part of a future dissertation or book project but the inspiration is there. Each person will present between 15, with one exception, up to 20 minutes. And then we will have 10 to 15 minutes of discussion and conversation for each paper. So we have two exceptions of 20 minutes presentation. But before we start, I would like to express our solidarity with the inspiring women's movement in Iran, and our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people, and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homelands. I would like to start with the presentations. Will start with by Negar Banisafar, who will be speaking on staging a cinematic revolution. Right before we start, I would like to thank you all for joining us for this interesting experimental presentation. Negar.
Thank you all for participating in our graduate symposium. So the title of my paper is Staging a Cinematic Revolution. In this paper, I researched the cinematic discourse in Ferdowsi Weekly magazine from October 1978 to April 1979, when revolutionary fervor in Iran was at its peak. The cinematic rhetoric in Ferdowsi indicates a falsification of Iranian cinema before the 1979 revolution and staying silent over the internationally acclaimed Iranian movies before 1979 that manifested cultural transformations. I argue that such falsifications and silences were adopted by Ferdowsi magazine as a tool to craft a collective discontent and form a mass mobilization against the ancien regime. Ferdowsi's take on cinema, you can go to the next slide. Ferdowsi's take on cinema in October 1978 starts with an introduction to a series of articles that will continually be published until 16th of April 1979 with the topic of political cinema. These articles are from the book Politics and Film by Leif and Isaacson, translated by Abul Hassan Tabatabai, and they survey the formation of the political and propagandist cinema of wartime, such as the Soviet Union and Nazi cinema. Tabatabai, in the introduction to the first publication of the series of articles, writes, quote, "We can no longer consider cinema as mere entertainment or artwork or even a mix of the two. Cinema can be a reflection of current affairs, social idealism, beliefs, and political matters," end quote. Since this article is chosen as the introduction to a long series of other articles published until 1980, one could agree that a social realist approach is the manifesto of Ferdowsian cinema and what they consider part and parcel of what cinema ought to be. We can go to the next slide. Throughout issue number 1 of the magazine, published on October 9, 1978, the only article on Iranian cinema written by Aleph Ain is titled Iranian Cinema, the Bazaar for Displaying the Ravages of Sex and Violence. The aim of the masters of the business of war cinema is to exploit and narcotize the thoughts of the nations. In this article, the author dreams of a bygone era a nostalgia for almost 2 decades ago, when cinema halls in Iran displayed thoughtful movies, even if they had been made for fun and entertainment purposes. Through this nostalgic theme, the author criticizes the current situation in the cinema halls of their time and the screening of movies that are only entertainment focused and narcotize the audience. Of course, one could argue that praising cinematic forms and content of an era over another without considering the temporal differences is subject to further in-depth analysis. Such comparisons are less likely a reasonable explanation and can remain only as nostalgia since they lack factual evidence. Further in the article, Elahé explains that one cannot deny that back then, there used to be much better movies made in the world. But he asserts, even then, the business of film screening was exclusively in the hands of Hollywood commercial movies, and thus he believes that people, quote, people viewed the world through the seductive lens of this deploying tool and got used to it, a pattern which brought about some sort of imitative strategy in our indigenous cinema, to which later on the imitation of movies with Indian and Arabic style was added. End quote. But even then, he asserts that movies were more worth viewing. He also states how there is a need for screening of movies such as Bicycle Thieves, Battleship Potemkin, and Mother, all of which contain themes of social realism, war, and revolutionary struggles. However, unlike what the author claims, movies such as the Bicycle Thieves were screened in Iran. Go to the next slide. According to Gulbagh Talai, in Iranian cosmopolitanism, for example, a quote, in 1954, for example, the biggest cinema festival of the year was organized to be solely dedicated to the great masterpieces of Italian cinema, including films such as Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves, end quote. So again, it appears that there are factual mistakes in the article in Ferdowsi by Elahé, and it could only be regarded as a nostalgically driven writing. However, thinking about Elahé's choice of good movies like Desica's and having in mind the political cinema articles published throughout the span of 1 year in Ferdowsi, one can realize that the rhetoric used by this magazine is anti-imperialist, and according to their parameters, a good movie is one that reflects socio-political tensions of the time. Next slide. In fact, in another article published on 16th of October 1978 in Ferdowsi, the writer Parham announces the opening of a newly compiled program in Kanun Film Tehran that aims to screen significant movies in the history of world cinema. He emphasizes his content over the inclusion of movies from the Soviet Union in the program and how Russian movies in the 1920s were, quote, a reconstruction of the revolutionary struggle, and how concepts in Soviet movies were expressed in a way that emphasized the union of the masses and their preparedness for courageous confrontation with the challenging early years of the 20th century, end quote. So overall, cinema as a tool for mass mobilization is one of the major themes in Ferdowsi magazine. Back to Elahé's article and numerous others as such in Ferdowsi, a pattern emerges that asserts good movies have lost their audience and people are not anymore drawn to quality movies due to destructive effects of film Farsi, which is the commercial pre-revolution Iranian cinema. So they relate all the destructive effects, destructive effects to film Farsi because they want to build a persuasive argument that it is because of such movies that vulgarism has become widespread in the country, and then relate such failure to corruption in Mohammad Pahlavi's government. Next slide. In the issue published on 26th of February 1979 by Ferdowsi, reflecting on the pre-revolution era, Mohsen Zargarian argues that, quote, people had acquired bad habits. They were not looking for good movies because they had not learned to watch them, and they were painfully drawn to simple and vulgar movies, end quote. But looking back at new wave or Mojano movies that were representative of thought-provoking artistic movies and an alternative for film Farsi in the pre-revolution era, and also reading interviews with directors says otherwise. Next slide. An example of this is seen in a report published in 1976 in issue 27 of Cinema, the periodical of the Tehran International Film Festival, where at a press conference with the cast and crew of the movie Malakut, or The Heavenly Kingdom, which is a non-commercial film directed by Khosrow Haritash, which combines surrealism with the horror genre. In the conference, Haritash is asked what he thinks about the negative reaction of the audience to his movie. The response, quote, "I was among the audience when the movie was shown on the screen. It made the audience mesmerized, so much so that those special groups of people who had decided to react negatively to this movie before entering the arena forgot to boo until the movie was over," end quote. Also, in the same year, 1976, next slide, and in Cinema Periodical in issue 28, Iraj Saberi interviews Ali Hatami and asks him why his movie Baba Shamal faced commercial failure and dislike among the audience, and why it didn't sell like his previous movies, like Hassan Kachab. Hatami's response is worth noting. He answers, "I do not know why you say it didn't sell." Well, in fact, in the first screening, the movie sold approximately 800,000 tomans, while in that period, the average selling rate of a movie was either 500 or 600,000 tomans, end quote. In fact, it seems that the print media, in this case, Ferdowsi, tries to build a narrative in which people couldn't understand intellectual or thoughtful movies. Next slide. There is also a criticism of the Tehran International Film Festival expressed throughout the cinematic discourse of Ferdowsi. On the 20th of November, 1978, Parham wrote that the International Film Festival was a waste of the country's wealth in the last 10 years. He further claims that in the past decade, the International Festival has screened a, quote, "a nauseating intermixture of sex and violence." It is a residue, the movies exhibited in International Film Festival, he says, are a residue from the most vulgar so-called artistic works. And the festival, quote, "didn't have any benefits for the people and the indigenous cinema," end quote. Unlike Parham's claims, one could counter-argue that in the Tehran International Film Festival, there were screenings of movies from great masters of the world that were a unique experience for the audience to familiarize themselves with movies that were representative of cinema as an art form beyond the entertainment aspects of it. As Gulbarg Rekabtalai notes in Iranian Cosmopolitanism, quote, "the critically acclaimed Tehran International Film Festival succeeded in becoming a Class A festival, and according to Screen International, was on its way to rank second after the renowned Cannes Festival. This festival, argues Rekabtalai, was a highly reputable event, at least in its early phase, that benefited from the participation of many prominent actors, producers, and filmmakers, namely Antonioni." Once again, we encounter factual inconsistencies in Ferdowsi regarding the pre-revolutionary era in Iranian cinema. Next. Another pattern that emerged while researching Ferdowsi was the lack of articles that covered Iranian new wave movies, or at least interviews with their directors. Such lack of coverage becomes more noteworthy as these movies fit within the framework of what, in Ferdowsi's discourse and standards, is considered a proper cinema, which is an antithesis of film Farsi, and therefore it is anti-Fasad, chaste, and anti-imperialist. But there is neither coverage of film Farsi movies nor new wave ones. There is only criticism of film Farsi and complaints over the lack of proper or thought-provoking movies. Ferdowsi only briefly and marginally names a few new wave movies throughout 1 year. Only after the 1979 revolution, on 17th of July, 1979, issue number 36, Ferdowsi published an interview with Sohrab Shahid Saleh, one of the prominent Mojano directors who they approved of and whose films fell within their standards of a proper movie. Next. Another evidence of such silence is that falsely indicate a complete lack of artistic movies prior to the 1979 revolution is expressed by Parviz Shafo after the revolution on 19th of February 1979 in an article titled, quote, "A New Breath After the Cultural Suffocation. Let us allow to burgeon along with people after years," end quote. Shafa claims that the filmmaking industry in Iran, quote, "for almost 20 years was in ignorance, devoid of art and fruitless," end quote. At the end of his article, Shafa asserts that, quote, "after the difficult and dark years we passed, now the question is, can a cinema with an Iranian identity come to existence or not," end quote. There are two elements in Shafa's statement that need to be further discussed. The first is how he ignores the burgeoning of cinema before the revolution and the societal transformations caused by it. And the second point is seeking an indigenous cinema after the revolution. Shafar writes, let us allow art to burgeon after years of ignorance. But the truth is the burgeoning had been a long time in the making before 1979. The new wave movies, for example, caused cultural transformations on different societal levels, which makes one wonder how Ferdowsi magazine stays silent about this alternative cinema that can be a critique of film Farsi. A great example of questioning norms that were widely accepted within Iranian society is Baba Shamal, a musical directed by Ali Hatami. As Hamidreza Sadpur said in his book Iranian Cinema, this movie is, quote, based on an old tale about a love triangle involving a woman and two traditional wrestling champions. Of course, instead of the general term wrestling champions, it would be clearer to use the words Luti, tough guy, and Javan Mard, who's a brave and generous guy. The opening scene is at nighttime when a Fokoli or a dandy and a woman named Robabe are flirting in public. Suddenly, Luti Haidar arrives and observes their fleeting private movement, and thus their erotic time is interrupted by his arrival. Upon seeing the Luti, Fokoli escapes, and from then on, Luti Haidar decides to take revenge on him as he is a threat to the chastity of the women in the neighborhood, over which he feels a sense of control. Unlike film Farsi plots that Luti is the one who's always right and enjoys people's approval for protecting their namus, here Javan Mard acts as a mediator between Luti and Fokoli, and thus Luti agrees to forgive Fokoli and protects him from other men in the neighborhood who have sworn to kill him. Another example of questioning cultural norms in a new wave movie is Downpour or Ragba, directed by Bahram Beyzai, in which love is shown in the context of a reason to struggle, to claim one's rights in an oppressive system. Having these examples in mind, which showcase societal change before 1979, it is not surprising when Sohrab Shahid Saleh, in an interview with Ferdowsi, indicates that movies of alter cinema, quote, opened the window into the day that people took to the streets, end quote. Alas, this interview was published only after the revolution on 17th of July, 1979, and the interviewer's question from Saleh was, quote, please share with us any thoughts you have regarding Iranian cinema in the period of suffocation and dark terror of the state, end quote. Now let's get back to discuss Shafa's statement that asked whether indigenous cinema could come into existence or not. Firstly, it is noteworthy that seeking indigenous cinema is at odds with the nature of this modern medium as a site of heterogeneous spatio-temporal crossings. It is also interesting to note how, should go to slide 14. It is also interesting to note how Sohrab Shahid Saleh in the interview discussed earlier responds to the question of whether he believes in the existence of a national identity in cinema. He answers, quote, in my opinion, the cinema of each country has to deal with its culture and socio-political issues of that country. And by the way, let's not forget that the language of cinema is international, end quote. In other words, the lack of indigenous Iranian cinema for which Ferdowsi would criticize the cinematic productions before the revolution conflicted with the nature of cinematic media. On the other hand, coming to existence indicates that there has never been an indigenous Iranian cinema before the revolution. However, we can see indigenous elements in numerous film Farsi and alter cinema movies. For example, Ali Hatami used Iranian folklore, religious rituals, and traditional costumes in his films. The opening credits of Baba Shamal start with a screening of a set of paintings that are part of the Naqali tradition in Iran, over which there's a voiceover of a Naqal that works as a prelude to the movie. Another discourse Ferdowsi emphasized was sex, the decadent image of women, and film Farsi's, quote, deadly and destructive impact on youth, end quote. Aleph Ain argues that these, quote, colorful, narcotizing, sexually stimulating movies satisfy the animalistic desires of the youth. And then he links the reason these movies are shown on the screens to infiltration of Western exploitation in Iranian culture and renders these movies as addictive drugs. Here, I should note that I do not attempt to discuss how film Farsi, contrary to how Ferdowsi framed it, was a mirror that reflected the societal tensions between tradition and modernity. These have been discussed at length by scholars such as Gulbagh Talai. In this paper, I want to draw attention to Ferdowsi's lack of coverage and their silence over new wave movies that captured cultural transformations and a transformed individuality, which is absent in Ferdowsi's cinematic discourse. For example, in Downpour, the love rivals come from two different classes in society. One of them is a teacher and the other is a tough guy. We would all think that in the end, the teacher or the tough guy wins the girl's heart, and we expect the woman to be submissive. However, although the female character lives with her old mute mother and little brother, makes a living by working at a tailor's shop, and lives under the pressure of patriarchal society's intruding eyes. In the end, she chooses neither the tough guy nor the teacher and decides to continue her path alone, which is an example of the female agency before the revolution in 1979. And for sure, there are many other examples like that out there, but Ferdowsi didn't publish articles on them and chose to stir up discontent by showing film Farsi as one of the root causes of vulgarism in society. The conclusion, staging a cinematic revolution. Vulgar, imperialist, imitative, and entertainment-driven, lacking indigenous elements, narcotic, destructive. The adjectives and phrases used by Ferdowsi to refer to the Iranian cinema of the pre-revolution era remind one of the apocalyptic situation that asked for immediate change. With the choice of publishing articles over political cinema in 1 year, and the suggestion of movies that are emblems of social realism and cinema of revolution, it seems that Ferdowsi advocated a socially responsible, anti-imperialist, and indigenous cinema. Moreover, Ferdowsi magazine staged a lack of movies with these elements in Iranian cinema, while many Mojano movies, such as the ones discussed in this paper, fell within the standards of what this magazine considered proper cinema. Ferdowsi stayed silent about movies that were good, but their standards, and they also advocated the idea that people are not drawn to good movies because they are not trained to watch them, as they are only entertainment-driven. The reality, however, seemed to be something else. Therefore, Ferdowsi staged a lack of what had already existed in Iranian cinema and propagated false ideas on both film Farsi and alternative cinema. The cinematic discourse in Ferdowsi is a call for change. The pattern, heightening the severity of film Farsi and its impacts on society, hiding information about alternative cinema, and then revealing some tiny fraction of facts about it, brings to mind Theda Skocpol's argument about the Iranian Revolution. Skocpol in Rancher State and Shia Islam in the Iranian Revolution argues that, quote, if ever there has been a revolution deliberately made by a mass-based social movement aiming to overthrow the old order, the Iranian Revolution against the Shah surely is it, end quote. She further claims that, quote, the people of urban Iran did accomplish, end quote, what Western socialists had long dreamt of doing, quote, as they mobilized in an all-inclusive movement against the corrupt imperialist monarchy. The revolution didn't just come. It was deliberately and coherently made, specifically in its opening phase. The overthrow of the old regime, end quote. The discourse in Ferdowsi also aims at framing pre-revolution Iranian cinema as corrupt, anti-chaste, imperialist, and imitative, cinema as a Western agent that propagates vulgarism, and all other constituent elements that could mobilize people against the ancien regime. And Ferdowsi does this by making invisible the cultural transformation caused by the new wave cinema, and bringing to the fore the anti-chaste discourse. Roderick Aya, in Rethinking Revolutions, argues that, quote, revolutionary situations have occurred when ordinary people attempted not to make revolution, but to get or keep things they felt entitled to, end quote. I argue that Ferdowsi's cinematic discourse stages a lack of what people were entitled to, such as being independent of imperialist powers, and above all, the idea of chastity, which is a very controversial one considering the religious ties of the Iranian society. The anti-chaste element that Ferdowsi attributes to Iranian cinema before 1979 had the potential to trigger people's wrath against the regime and give them the courage to go and fight. So here one could say, by staging Iranian cinema as something that it wasn't, Ferdowsi played a part in orchestrating a cinematic discontent that could turn into a collective fury and coalition of people. The idea of the union of the people was of high significance to Ferdowsi at that period, so much so that they decided to make corrections to an article that focused on the idea of love. On 23rd of October 1978, a piece written by the prominent Iranian painter Iran Darudi was published in Ferdowsi titled love has the highest point of value in people's lives. In this piece, Darudi expressed her opinion that what an essential role love plays in human life, and love is representative of mind growth. She adds that to be able to love in life, humans must first own themselves. Surprisingly, a week later, on 30th of October 1978, we read a correction to the previous piece where she writes, quote, amidst the transformation that our society is going through, speaking of love is either a mistake or off topic. What we need are union and sympathy. What I meant by love is brotherhood and union among my compatriots, end quote. And then Ferdowsi's editing team also expresses their content over Darudi's further explanation. Such propagandist rhetoric is frequently seen in Ferdowsi, and in the case of cinema, it appears that they were selective in choosing a discourse that created a collective discontent over the quality of movies and the cultural realm on a broader scale. And therefore, not only did they alter the truth about film Farsi, but also it seems that they swept new wave movies that heralded cultural transformations under the rug to create a revolutionary situation in favor of the political revolution.
Negar Banisafar, thank you very much. There must be some questions, please, both online and in person. Gunha, please.
So thank you so much for your great presentation, Negar. This is out of my personal interest. Does Ferdowsi contains any critique outside the scene of cinema? For example, I'm curious about whether any filmmakers commented on the Cinema Rex fire incident. That kind of like
No filmmakers, but politicians. Yeah, as far as I know, it was I didn't see any interviews with filmmakers or anything about that. Interviews happened only after the revolution, after Bahman Panjoha, and only with Sohrab Shahid Saleh, I guess. Yeah.
Leila, please.
Thank you so much, Negar John, for your great presentation. I know it's a research on the Ferdowsi magazine from Tavakoli archive.
Yeah, I forgot to write that. Sorry.
And
I'm so sorry.
And you said that Ferdowsi magazine is acting as an avant-garde magazine that talks about the quality of the movies. I just wanted to see that if you have came across other magazine that kind of messages otherwise, or they have a different kind of criticizing.
I think I haven't researched the other ones thoroughly. I can't be sure about that, but I think Etalot has sort of more nuanced, I guess.
So how did you decide to just doing the Ferdowsi magazine?
It was like I didn't have, because of the scope of the class that we have, and it's like a researcher, I decided to focus on Ferdowsi, and then maybe later on we can expand that to Etalot, and I ended on it.
Other questions? If not, how did the discourse of Ferdowsi on cinema shape the post-revolutionary cinema? Was this sort of an emerging language, for example, the focus on chastity, on corruption, on anti-imperialism, and rejection of a particular kind of film Farsi? How did that shape the production of films in the post-revolutionary period?
Yeah, I think Ferdowsi's discourse, cinematic discourse, mostly changed, or let's say heralded an era that mostly was based on a purified sort of cinema that is devoid of romanticism or eroticism, and also a kind of politically correct, according to their ideas, like post-revolutionary ideas, politically correct cinema, let's say. But I think all of this started changing after the war, Iran-Iraq wars, and started to loosen a bit.
Mohamad Jan, I have من رضا موینی هستم.
Yes, please, بفرمایید.
I just wanted to thank Farbod for bringing my dear friend's name, Mr. Shafa. Mr. Shafa passed away a few years ago in Northern California. I should say Professor Shafa. He's got over 11 books in English and translated. And he used to be the head of the university in Tehran, but most of his time was spent in California. He went to San Francisco State University, and he was very prominent. He was very down to earth. So you don't hear a lot about him. And I encourage the students to really search more about him and find out about his books in English and Persian. And his brother has in Tehran every year, has a film festival, Parviz Shafa and Saeed. Saeed is having 2-3 film festivals every year. So I encourage to contact him and search more about Shafa. Shafa was a very unique person in the Iranian cinema, but so down to earth that we don't hear much about him. And thank you, Farbod, for this.
It is, by the way, Negar Banisafar, who presented the paper. Farbod is
the name of the Zoom.
is the name of the page. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw the name underneath there. So
That is
I,
fine.
Thank you so much
Oh.
thank you so much. I will go just research about Mr. Shafa.
Yeah. Yes, Parviz passed away, but his brother Saeed writes frequently on different magazines, and of course has several, I think 3 different festivals every year.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you much. Negar, outstanding presentation. And I hope later on you're able to expand the scope beyond
Yeah.
Ferdowsi, looking at other newspapers, journals, and see how the discourse on cinematic revolution is shaped during the revolutionary period.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Sara Molaee is our next presenter, and she's speaking on the Iranian Women's Revolution, 1978-1979. Sara Molaee,
Sure.
please.
Let me first share my screen and then I'll
Okay.
start. Okay, thank you very much for having me today. I'm going to talk about the Iranian Women's Revolution in 1978, 1979. I will discuss how exploring and studying literary work help us to understand historical events such as Iranian Revolution in a more profound way. I will also discuss how women in the Iranian Revolution, they've been a voice and actually a major component of the revolution. But because of the hegemonic look that we have towards the historical event, the women end up participating in a revolution that, their voice got lost, and also they participate in a revolution that end up being so oppressive towards women. So our discussion today, has 3 main sections. First, I'm going to talk about the prevailing perspective of historical temporalities, specifically in the case of Iranian Revolution. Then I will touch on some modern literary theories and how the conception of time and history, the concept of time is being understood through these literary theories, and how this new conception of time and history helps us to understand Iranian Revolution and the nature of it. So I first start with Marcel Proust. In general, modern historians and scholars, they have hegemonic look at historical events. In early 20th century, Marcel Proust, in his prominent novel In Search of Lost Time, he brings some new conception of time. For example, he reveals involuntary memory, or how the culture and social life of a certain period can be wrecked by the clash of, norms, values, and tastes, or how even in individual level, contemporary people can mentally live totally a different world. In a discussion about the similarity of appearance of people, of people in different ages, he is having a statement saying that the truth is that the similarity of dress and also the reflection from a person's face of the spirit of his age, l'esprit de l'époque, occupies so much more space than his cat. So even someone like Marcel Proust with his, new ideas of time and temporality falls into the, hegemonic way of looking the historical epic. He is looking at the conformity or the unity of, certain historical period. In the case of Iranian Revolution, I start first with Nikki Keddie. She believes that the Iranian Revolution was a unique phenomenon because it did not fit any of the models that was so far, had been offered by thinkers and scholars. She draws one single line from the Constitutional Revolution toward the 1979 revolution. And she claims that 1979 revolution was a move toward orthodoxy. And in fact, it was a legacy that started, during the Constitutional Revolution, because many ulama and clergy actively, they participated in that revolution. And part of the exceptionality of the Iranian Revolution comes from the 1979 revolution, comes from Khomeini being an exceptional man, an exceptional and charismatic religious leader. So basically, she draws one line, through the 20th century, and she sees that this tendency of Iranians toward religiosity was really feeding the Iranian Revolution and the establishment of an Islamic regime. After that, I would like to concentrate on Dr. Saeed Amir Arjomand. In one of his articles about the comparative study of, the Iranian Revolution, he emphasizes that so far, at least in the case of the 1979 revolution, scholars have concentrated on the causes and preconditions of the revolution, while it is equally important to understand and analyze the revolution based on the consequences. And of course, he knows that there is a gap between these causes and consequences, but he says this is the ideology. The ideologies, fills the gap between these causes and consequences. He states the ideologies that set the revolutionary struggle in motion and are shaped in its course bridge the gap between the causes and consequences of revolutions. So Dr. Arjomand also falls into another way of hegemonic, way of thinking of revolution, that it was kind of ideological revolution, drawing one line from the pre-revolutionary era that moves toward, revolution and post-revolutionary Iran. Heather Skocpol is an American sociologist, and she is a big fan of the role of peasantry in the revolution. And, she has an economic analysis of Iranian revolution, but she basically claims that it was the urban mass, the demonstration in the cities that made the revolution happen. However, the big component was the support of the peasantry who already migrated from villages to the cities. So in previous decades, like 1950s, 1960s, and 70s, many villagers, they migrated from their villages to the cities, and this supported the mass, demonstration in the cities, which made the revolution happen. About the uniqueness of Iranian revolution, Skocpol believes that the Iranian revolution was not type of revolution that came, but it was made. How was it made? She says it was made through a set of cultural and organizational forms, thoroughly socially embedded in the urban communal enclaves that became the centers of popular resistance to the Shah. And she goes further. She discusses it was the Shiite Islamic network that, managed this network and, pushed in these organizational activities toward the resistance against the Shah. After that, I would like to concentrate on Michael Foucault, one of the few or rare, Westerners who had a first-hand experience of observing the Iranian Revolution, back then. So Foucault strongly agreed that Iranian Revolution was absolutely, something, as Behruz Qamari says, anti-teleological. So it did not have anything with the models that Westerners so far offered in their theories or the models of revolution. He analyzed Iranian Revolution based on his own experience and observation, saying that these demonstrations were literally the demonstration of collective will of people to restore their religious life, to restore their public rights. He calls this demonstration on the street, which he emphasized that kept being repeated. He saw that as a political spirituality. That's the uniqueness, according to Foucault, of the revolution in Iran, or at least one of the uniqueness. He states religion transforms thousands of forms of discontent, hatred, misery, and despair into a force. It transforms them into a force because it's a form of expression, a made of social relation, a supple and widely accepted elemental organization, a way of being together, a way of speaking and listening, something that allows one to be listened to by others. So even it's been hugely discussed, the way that Foucault is looking at religion and perceiving religion is not similar to what Iranian or Middle Eastern are defining or perceiving religion. But still Foucault puts seat and identifies religion as one of the important factor that is shaping and making this collective will of people that is pushing that forward towards the winning of the revolution. So far, these ideas and similar ideas, this hegemonic way and look at the Iranian Revolution has a deep root in the Hegelian idea of world spirit or Zeitgeist, that in every historical period, every historical epoch, there is a spirit that is dominating its historical events. And this way, there is some sort of conformity, there is some sort of unity, or these events are unified in a certain way. Let's move to literary theory and the conception of time. So in 20th century, Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, in one of his discussions about the evolution of the epic forms, he compares the becoming of epic forms to the evolution of the Earth's surface through the geological ages. What does that mean? Well, in the first level, it means literary transformation are super slow. They happen super gradually. In the second level, it means literary genres and styles inclined toward describing the very minor shifts, the very minor changes that happens in a certain historical epoch or a certain context. Later in the 20th century, we have other critical thinker, Theodor Adorno, Ernest Gombrich, and the contemporary literary critic Guido Mazzoni. They all admit that art and literature register the history of humanity with more justice, and they criticize that cultural historian or social historian, they do not have the sensitivity that art and literature have, and they fall into the hegemonic idea according mostly to the Hegelian paradigm. Rita Polsky is another critic, another literary critic who extensively discussed that text is an autonomous being. Text not only at some point can be influenced or at some point shaped by historical events, but it also made historical events happen. So she introduces texts or literary works are actually non-human actors. And at the core of her discussions, she talks about this notion of time, which is different than the Hegelian idea. She states time is not a tight sequence of partition units, but a profusion of whirlpools and rapids, eddies and flows, in which objects, ideas, images, and texts from different moments swirl, tumble, and collide in ever-changing combination and constellations. So let's keep that in mind, and then we get back to this idea. Among the contemporary scholars, I limited my scope to only three figures: my professor, Dr. Tavakoli, Dr. Farzaneh Milani, and Dr. Ahmad Karimi Haqqaq, who are welcoming the study of literature in order to understand Iranian history, especially Iranian revolution, in a more profound way. I start with Dr. Karimi Haqqaq. So Karimi Haqqaq, in one of his articles about post-revolutionary Persian literature, he talks about how writers have autonomy. So he brings a few things, including saying that despite being restricted, exiled, and persecuted, after the revolution, writers always go beyond the societal boundaries. Writers are the leaders of their ideological journey, not the states. And that makes sense because if these writers were not crossing the boundaries, they wouldn't be exiled or imprisoned. Or writers have the actual agency and power, not the oppressive state. Aligned with Karimi Haqqaq, we have Dr. Farzaneh Milani, who is the scholar of women's studies and feminist studies in the, in Iranian history. In her work, Veils and Words, she helps us to understand the very long history of women poetry as a literary trend, which is rooted in the earlier centuries, 19 and even earlier centuries, 19th century and the earlier centuries. And this literary trend, the women poetry, has been an essential element of women movement in Iran. And as we are entering the 20th century and moving, forward, we are having a contribution and a flourish of women's prose aligned with women poetry and the development of, women movement. She, in her writing, Dr. Milani anticipates women's writing carry insurrection and some sort of appropriation of the established norm eventually. Among the styles that she introduces about the genre of women prose, she talks about the writing of autobiography, short stories, novels, which deserve, consideration and study and exploration. However, when I encountered the Tavakoli archive, I noticed that there have been tremendous letters written by women to different magazines, periodical, newspaper, including Ayandegan, which I'm sharing here with you. And these women, during the 1978 and 1979, 1978 and 1979, they're tremendously publishing articles talking about the issues of women. In the 1978, most of them are talking about what is their expectation out of, the coming government, the future government, what image they are looking about a, liberal and free society, what are the rights of women as individuals, and what should be done. They are also talking about what the sufferings of women are, what kind of reformation should happen, what things are promised. When the revolution happens, even early in 1979, many of these women noticed that the state or the power is being oppressive toward women, and they are actually being deprived from the very minimum rights they used to have before the revolution. So they react to this and take immediate action, sending more letters and talking about, what they're losing, what they are asking again, reminding them of the, of their rights, of their demands. And these are only some excerpt, of some of them. There have been many letters in many, magazines and in general in the press that women are, contributing to the revolutionary movement and talking about their own demands. So what does this tell us? Before drawing my conclusion, before getting to my conclusion, I would like to refer to Negar Banisafar statement about the pattern of revolution and their approach towards women in the Middle East. So she says, historically, when women have taken to the streets in these revolts, shoulder to shoulder with their men in Algeria, in Iran, and in Egypt, it has been they, the women, who, when victory was won, were forgotten and once again banished in their apartments. So obviously, there is this tendency, there is this, it's not only Iran, even surrounding region, we see that it's easily women get forgotten, easily their voice get lost. And I would like to concentrate on 3 points here. That the unexplored archive of the letters of women, because the letters of women are another style of the prose that women are, contributing to the development of women movement, either in Ayandegan or other periodical. This unexplored archive belonged to a larger project, and that larger project was Women Revolution. women revolution, as we addressed, it was already going on in the earlier centuries. It started in earlier centuries. It developed during the 20th centuries. When the 1979 movement happens, this women movement and women revolution actually, it merges with the 1979 uprising. It gained a louder voice because we see how many numerous, letters of women being published in the press. And it also energized the revolution of the 1979, uprising. However, because of this hegemonic way of or understanding of revolution, either as scholars or non-scholars, their voice have been lost, and their rights also have been, denied even after the revolution. What does our, discussion today tell about the nature of the true nature of the Iranian Revolution? Is that Iranian Revolution was not a move toward orthodoxy, as Nikki Katie addressed, for example, or it was not an ideological revolution in its nature, but it was actually a democratic revolution. It was containing women revolution inside of that, and it was echoing the voice of many oppressed, a diverse group of oppressed people. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sara Molaee. I am certain that there are numerous questions from your colleagues. Please.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating. I was wondering if you come across any kind of any kind of conception of time as a divider between West and East, in which like the progressive time, the kind of developing or evolutionary time is associated with the West, and the other times, like the weird time, the time of temporality or world, or the spirit of the world that is different from this kind of development idea, is assigned or associated with the East or Orient. Because it's a very prevalent sort of idea in anthropology that there is a study about time and the other, how time otherize. So I was wondering if you see, because I think gender is also could be the dimension which you brought very good about that part in my hand.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I haven't encountered that. Sorry, but if I understood you properly, are you saying that the Hegelian idea is dominant in the West only or mostly? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, kind of not Hegelian, but this idea that
world is spirit.
Yeah, but
Yes.
there are two spirits of world, or there is no homogeneous kind of time everywhere. So time is kind of sometimes is disrupted, departure, and some people lag behind and some people go forward. Because it's actually a kind of an Orientalist view of time. The Orientalists thought that the East has stayed in the stage of backwardness, and the West has gone forward, and it's a very prevailing idea in Iranian, not like sociologists, this idea.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I haven't encountered the time as otherness or something like that. I have encountered different theories of time, like the Einsteinian, objective, and the relativity of time, which is, I don't think it has anything in common with the Hegelian or world spirit, but not to that far. Sorry about that.
I think the question is really interesting question. That is this evolutionary, developmentalist, hegemonic, what you refer to as hegemonic conception of time. That is a unified, the spirit, the singular movement towards future. And then alternative would be simultaneity of different modes of temporality. And in your description would be women's time, that is simultaneous, contemporaneous, that is at the same time. It has its own tempo that is not necessarily the tempo of this hegemonic time. So in a sense, with your project, you are trying to recover the temporality and the futurality of a women's movement that gets overwhelmed and silenced through a revolution that is teleological and theological.
Thank you
Very
very
good.
much. Yeah.
Please, Mohammed, and then Professor.
I had a question regarding the grievances that the women had against the Shah government. Do you think they continued into the Islamic Republic, and was there a voice for opposition during the Islamic Republic? The earliest Islamic Republican period related to the Shah period, or just at the time of the Iranian government?
So early after the revolution, yes, there've been, I think, because the government is not fully shaped. So there is more flexibility with publishing women's, letters. And as I discussed, there are many of them, or even later in 1979, that criticizing, the system oppressive approach. Did I answer your question?
Professor Ibrahim.
Thank you, Sara, for contextualizing the idea of revolution, looking at several, what you call the women's revolution, and we're focusing on the Iranian case. So this argument that women's voices have been lost. Yeah, I would say that, to some extent, but it reminds me of what Spivak says about being effaced as you try to speak and having traces left. And even if you think about voice has echoes that kind of remain. That's what we are trying to do, looking at the archives and going back and getting those traces, right? Getting those, and you have many examples of, so maybe the voices aren't lost, but maybe mumbled and through the discourse that the revolution was an ideological only revolution. Yes, these voices get mumbled, but there are many other voices coming out. So what would you say? So you said that the women's revolution in Iran was part of the major revolt, democratic revolt that happened, and this has historical precedence. So what were some, just to clarify, I think I know what you mean, but just to maybe to reiterate, what is this women's revolution? What are its demands?
Yeah, maybe I had to speak more extensively about that. That women have been always through their prose or poetry talking about their sufferings, and most importantly, talking about their demands, because they're being oppressed. So what is the ideal thing? It's the emancipation of women. So different concepts that are relevant, or things, or whatever thinking is relevant to the emancipation of women, was basically, projected in these writings, either prose or poetry, talking about their own feeling in different level. If they're writing something about themselves, if they're writing about the social condition, they are trying to show that how suffered and oppressed the women are, how it is the result of the injustice that was going on, the oppression, either through religious type of life, or the system of the society, the structure of the society. That's basically, what they were trying to get out of the revolution. And even after the revolution, so it is important, yes, their voice got lost in a scholarly work, and they're not being, they didn't exist actually like the past, so they were forgotten, but they existed in an alternative way. So women's voice or their writing found an alternative way, and it's still, I would say, going on.
So a resistance to injustice, maybe.
Definitely, yes. Yeah.
Very good. Other questions? Yes, please.
Sorry, I have issue with using revolution or women's revolution.
Yeah.
I think it's more revolution is at one stage that you go from something to something else.
Yeah.
But I see many use revolution, but I think it's not a good.
Yeah.
Well, I would appreciate you did a very good presentation.
Thank you.
Another, there was a word from Hegel, I didn't know. I
Yeah.
did not
World spirit.
know other than that.
West guys, that's German word for
Oh,
the,
yes,
yeah,
word is.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, yes.
Any other? Well, thank you, Sara Molaee. Our next presenter is Gunha Kim, who is a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and he will be speaking on the Iranian revolutionary martyrology, 1978-1979. Gunha.
Good evening, everyone. Today, I'd like to share my study on the making of the politicized discourse of martyrdom during the revolutionary movements. In particular, I'll share my thoughts on the historiography on the topic of martyrdom and the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and suggest the inclusion of the necropolitical discussion on the topic. I particularly introduced the medical counter-narrative of martyrology against and through the conversation with which the rising revolutionary martyrology has articulated itself. The conventional chronology of the 1979 or 1978-1979 Iranian Revolution has defined the beginning of the revolutionary phase as a moment when Leotards, a pro-regime press, published a sensational article on January 7th, 1978, against Ruhollah Khomeini, claiming that he was a British agent serving colonialism and he is of Indian descent living an immoral life. The day after hearing the news, seminary students pushed Ayatollahs to take an action, and after another day, on January 9th, a mass rally took place, during which a seminary student was killed. Ayatollah Shariat Mandari issued a nationwide call to commemorate his 40th day of death according to Islamic tradition. The call was widely circulated through underground publication and cassettes, BBC, and word of mouth, and various opposition groups took this opportunity. 40 days later, on February 18th, protests took place in several cities, out of which Tabriz saw the most severe one, producing several numbers of deaths. From then on, the politicized commemoration of the deaths of martyrs continued in the cycle of 40 days, each time increasing its size on March 30th, May 8th, June 18th, July 28th, and until September 8th, when what we call Black or Bloody Friday, when the notorious general Ghulam Ali Owaisi was appointed and massacred people. From then on, protests were routinized and what's happening, and radicalized that every day has become Karbala. This ritualistic spectacle of death dominate the image of 1979 Iranian Revolution, influencing the post-revolutionary writing of revolution as Islamic. Michel Foucault, when he visited Iran at the end of the initial cycles during the summer, and Bloody Friday, and observed the role that the religious symbol of martyrdom played in mobilizing people, and found the possibility of challenging the teleological history of modernity based on Western model of secularization and modernization. Scholars have challenged the idea, the 1979 Iranian Revolution as solely being Islamic by incorporating various actors into their scholarship, such as leftists, women, secular nationalists, communists, poets, students, filmmakers, as well as religious and ethnic minorities like Iranian Jews. Accordingly, the calendar of the revolution has been renegotiated, some finding 10 poetry nights at Goethe Institute on October 1977 as a definite moment, while others find 1979 protests at Qom as the start of revolutionary movement, and very recently, some even pointed to Global 1968 and the student movement it accompanied as a starting point of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. But the understanding of martyrdom, however, has still generally fallen into the realm of religion, still understanding that the moment when this cycle of the commemoration of death happened, the previous movement has been subsumed under the leadership of radical Islamists supporting Khomeini, so that scholarship of Iranian martyrdom and revolution has focused on how the previously religious narrative and symbolism of martyrdom in Islam has turned itself into the political discourse. In this literature, the role of Ali Shariati is highlighted, who reinterpreted and reconstructed previously conservative Islam into a political and activist one, challenging the status quo and highlighted the concept of martyrdom as an activist mode of realizing the spirit of Imam Hussein with the possible influence of socialist guerrilla ideology. The post-revolutionary making of martyrdom as national ideology that highlighted the image of Khomeini and changed the materiality of the city landscape, particularly during the and after the Iranian war, has cemented this reading of martyrdom, centralizing its religious manifestation. In light of the recent development of studies on the topic of necropolitics, martyrdom has started to be studied in terms of the politics of death under its glorifying language, be it secular or religious. The concept of necropolitics appeared as a critique of the Foucauldian idea that the previously violent sovereign power that manifested itself through the execution of people has now become embedded in every subject in the form of biopower. Instead, in the necropolitical arguments, it proposes that the necropower that can divide who shall die and what kind of death matter is still alive, subjugating life to the power of death. The recent necropolitical discussion on the topic of martyrdom in Iran has studied the poets of martyrdom that sought to make death meaningful through the introduction of martyrdom as a union with God, giving new interpretation of medieval mystical concepts to mobilize young people during the revolutionary and wartime. Also, the epitaphs inscribed in the tombstone of war martyrs have been studied, observing the Islamic Republic's veneration of martyrdom to form morality through propagating death as a mediator of redemption. In addition to the previous necropolitical critique of the religio-cultural manifestation of martyrdom, I want to go back to the 40-day cycle that was crucial in the making of the revolution and supposedly changed the balance of power toward the Islamists. While I have to do more research on it myself, relying on a recent study by Arash Davari and Nagme Sohrabi in 2021, the first politicized commemoration of the death of the 40s happened on the suicide of national wrestler champion and a member of National Front's High Council, Gholam Reza Takhti, who was found dead at one hotel on January 7, 1968. He had a reputation as a model of traditional masculinity, or Jaban Mardone, consisting of both physical power and communal engagement. Ethelwald published his poor family life, but the public did not believe his suicide. Accordingly, his 40s became the occasion of mass protests, in which student activism for the first time came outside of school and made an ally with the workers, chanting that he has been martyred. Before their studies, the death of Ayatollah Khomeini's son Mustafa's death in October 1977 has been considered the first occasion when the 40s has become politicized. Similar martyrification of figures and suspicion of their deaths have ensued. People were suspicious of the death of Samad Berangi, story writer, teacher, and social activist who drowned in the river in August 1968, Ali Shariati, who died of heart attack in June 1977, and Farooq Farooqzad, a woman poet and a film director who died of a car accident in 1968. Their death was supposedly irrelevant to the regime, and I would say I don't know the fact either. But why did people increasingly focus on the reason for death and try to read their deaths on their own cost? What was the epistemological background of this rising political discourse on death, other than the rising death and rising distrust of the regime? So I suggest it was because the death was increasingly becoming the locus of state intervention during this period, and particularly the pathologizing narrative of voluntary death on the rise, so that the discourse of martyrology articulated itself against it. I particularly observed the rise through the psychiatric journal called Ravan Pezeshki, first published in 1969 under the directorship of French-trained medical professor at the University of Tehran, Abdul Hossein Mir-Sepasi, one of the foundational figures of modern Iranian psychiatry, who actually coined the Persian term for psychiatry. The topic of suicide in this magazine has gradually become one of its major interests. Discussion of suicide first appeared in its third issue in 1969 as a call for attention, alarmed by reports from World Mental Health Organization, and increased increased through the translations of several French articles between 1969 to 1973, and expanded to include the first Iranian case study in 1974, and culminated to the publication of special issue dedicated to the topic of suicide in 1975. I suppose the direct background of the rise in the study of suicide might be the suicide of Gholam Reza Takhti we talked about, as well as the other politicized voluntarization of death. Lokman Danesh, who was a neurologist at Tehran University, claims in this journal that suicide is not a mark of madness, nor a sign of genius, but a symptom of social pathology. This research, published in 1974 by Abdul Hossein Mir Sepasi, is noteworthy. It was the first Iranian case study published after 4 years of translatory work. The article has two major arguments about suicide in Iran. First, distinctively in Iran, women kill themselves more than men. Second, people mostly kill themselves because of marriage and family issues in Iran. I argue this conclusion might have been either a deliberate act of feminization and domestication of suicide, or the representation and reproduction of the previous conception of suicide as feminine and personal, as opposed to public and political, and I'll tell you why. First of all, the statistic of suicide cases in this study were based on the data from a poison hospital in Tehran, not distinguishing completed and attempted suicide. Since from the previous translation of foreign articles that this journal contains, Iranian psychiatrists were informed about the tendency of women relying more on poison as a method of suicide in the United States, and the difference between attempted suicide and suicide, in which women commit suicide more than men, but actually men die more of a suicide in other places of the world. Secondly, related to domestication, the first question very next to the sex asks whether the patient is satisfied with their job. It reflects the tendency of the Western academia on this topic during this time that highlights the occupation of those who commit suicide, during which a prejudice that dentists are most likely to kill themselves were formed. But this research does away with such question by asking this simple question. Instead, based on this data that most people who commit suicide are married and living with their family, he claims that marriage and suicide were the main causes of suicide in Iran, supporting it with the questionnaire that directly asked patients for the reason for their suicide. The first being family issues, second, economic or job problems, third, psychiatric problems, physical problems, and the fourth, relationship or sexual problems. The researcher doesn't control the variable by comparing the statistic with the overall population of Tehran who are married or who are living with their family. Instead, he seeks to localize suicide as a distinct form of social pathology owing to the destruction of family, in his word, quote, a unit of society and its moral and religious foundation that should be saved in order to save the society, unquote. I'd like to propose that this pathologizing trend of death can be observed later in the newspaper. On January 8, 1978, a day after it published the sensational article against Khomeini and the day before the protest at Qom that heralded subsequent chains of protests would take place, Leotards published the article titled, "For each 300,000 Iranians, only one psychiatrist exists." This article talks about a modern man of the age of the machine who is lost and agonizing, who searches for a way to escape, but swords that fell on his body torment him, but that he cannot see. Things are involuntary, but cannot be explained. As he does not want to be an enemy to himself, eventually he relies on alcohol and opium and get rid of the place for the soul from the body and commit suicide. This article also discusses psychosomatic illness of mothers that accompanies physical symptoms due to psychological reasons and claims that 70% of Iranian patients nowadays are ill from psychosomatic illness, not the real physical one. While the article does not directly mention the increasing protests taking place, considering the timing it was published, the article considered increasing distress among people as naturalized and psychologized, making the pain that is experienced in real by the patient as psychological by the doctor. And again, this problem is alluded to as feminine and domestic. Taking this pathologizing undertone into account, I also observed the subsequent discussion of protests and the people who were killed during the protest in the same newspaper at Elahé. This is a small article published on January 10, 1978, 2 days after the initial protest at Qom. The title goes, "In bloody protest at Qom, 6 people killed and 9 people injured." In this article, disruptive students instigated chaos and riots against national interests. Their violent nature is highlighted. Protesters with sticks, rocks, and metal rods broke glasses of stores and banks and attacked the office of Resurrection Party and police stations. Officers who were supervising the area had to do something, and after continuous warnings and aerial shootings, they had to fire at protesters. Among them was a 13-year-old student that under the hand and foot of a crowd was killed. What we can notice from this article is a highlight of the violent characteristics of crowd and the harm it inflicted on the nation state, considering them as a social malady that should be inevitably suppressed rather than conceiving this protest as political. After similar coverage during the second title, and let's just jump to the October after the Black Friday incident and the protest was routinized. This article records the people being killed and injured during the revolutionary movement in various cities of Shareza, Despol, Isfahan, Abadeh, Eklit, Bebehan, Abbas, and so on. It depicts protesters as pathologens that inflict harm upon the function of nation body. I'd like to connect this observation to the study on carceral modernity by Golnar Nikifor in 2021, where she studied the development of criminology in Iran during the 1960s and 1970s. It increasingly understood criminals in pathological terms, during which the regime tried to turn its prison into a place where the state would transform the bad criminals into the good citizens. So finally, I would like to end my presentation by presenting this letter published in early 1978 in Junbesh, a journal containing left-leaning secular intellectuals that eventually sought fusion with Shiism. It contains a letter from the father and the mother of martyr named Mohammad Tavakoli, a graduate of Tehran University's Law and Political Science Department. They also have a son who had already been martyred and another son who graduated from the same Tehran University, majoring in economics and now is in jail. The letter highlights their sadness of their losing son, the torture that the regime has inflicted on him, and the recognition that there are more parents like them. The article ends by, "Our children trod the road of Islam and victory of Imam Hussein, and we are sure that Muhammad is now in heaven next to the martyrs of Islam. Our boys were good and kind. They read religious books most of the time, and they occasionally interpreted Quran for us. I would note during this time, the focus of martyrology was on victimhood and sorrows rather than the concept of death as a life. In future research, I hope to discover more of the actual voice of people like this, squeezed between two necropolitical discourses, articulating and strengthening each other. Between two growing necropolitical discourses that simplify death through its pathologization or glorification, there lies a doubtful, uncertain, precarious, self-questioning, fragile, and agonizing modern human being in the making vis-a-vis destined death of oneself and the others. This is the end of my presentation, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Gunha, for your interesting presentation. We have several minutes for questions, please. Yes, Mohammed.
Yeah, I had a question for Gunha. So I was wondering regarding the persistence of the sort of culture of martyrology, did it persist into the post-revolutionary period, and how did it persist throughout the present day based on your research? So it's a very general question, but I'm just wondering if there's some sort of continuing history in the martyrology in the Iranian context.
I think that's a good question, and of course, the Islamic government tried to strengthen the culture of martyrdom as a like national cultural ideology of the state. particularly during the Iran-Iraq War, like that follows right after the Iranian Revolution and continued for like 8 years. So that they would build like national symmetry with the martyrs, and they would build a museum on the martyrs. And I talked about the change of material change in city landscape. Like they changed the name of the streets into the name of the martyrs, so that they would utilize this martyrdom as their national ideology. It's like mobilizing like people.
Very good.
Go ahead.
Just, I really enjoyed your presentation. The question that I have, how you see this, the idea of martyrology in the new Iranian revolution for the life of women life movement? Just I want to know that it was only during the Islamic Revolution, or this is a tradition that continued even on the other side.
I think what I forgot the scholar's name, but there's expression necropolitical resistance. It is based on the study on the Turkish case that starting from the 1970s, protesters would use their death as a method for protesting, so that they would show their prolonged death by self-starvation or self-immolation in order to protest against the regime that increasingly intervened into the life of the people, so that the only thing that could protest against the state is not through life but through the death, that they are voluntarily escaping the zone of life the state is prescribing to them. And I think there are lots of similarities during this movement, that there are lots of martyrs being produced. And when I see like Instagram page of like BBC Persian, every day I see the scene of funerals, and the people gather to make this funeral as an occasion to share their sentiments. And the death itself has also become the method to protest against the regime. The case that I remember is in France, where the PhD student who is majoring in history committed suicide at the river, and saying that his death is meant to protest against Islamic Republic. And here, the death itself is highlighted.
Professor Ibrahim.
There is for sure this kind of fetishization of death. And even if you go back to the mystic poets, this life was described as a dream, and the real life, the awakening, is after death. So there's that dark death drive, maybe that Freud talks about, that goes back throughout our history. And even in the woman life freedom movement, you see that the death of Mahsa Amini, who is the martyr of the revolution that's going on, or the movement, has spiked a lot of political attention. So it's very interesting. This idea, even nostalgia for what is lost forever, comes from that fascination with death and the Iranian culture. So that was mostly a comment. And I want to commend you on your pronunciation of Om, which is so difficult to say, but you did a great job.
I think you know that.
Yeah.
Just one comment. The paper was outstanding, and I think you can put it in a much larger context of sort of Iran as an ill nation about to die. In the early part of the 20th century, Iran was physically ill. By later part of in 1960s and 70s, increasingly the discussion was a spiritually ill nation. And in a sense, a lot of the Iranian clerics came to utilize psychoanalysis and writings in Rabanshanasi and psychological essays in order to shape their preachings and their lectures and their writings. And thus, you have the conjuncture of this sort of increased attention on death, and the clerics increasingly emerged as necropoliticians, guardians of death, and that as increasingly the revolutionary movement, particularly Iranian leftists, began to focus on martyrdom and celebrating and heroizing martyrdom, the guardians of death or the necropoliticians began to gain the upper hand in leading the revolution, in a sense, by focusing not on life, but on death. Then the clerics emerge as the spiritual physicians. I mean, in a sense, in much of the 1960s and 1970s, they are referring to themselves, or they are referred to as spiritual doctors. So spiritual doctors become increasingly hegemonic and began to represent the nation and promise the curing of it through a spiritual revolution, a religious revolution.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to hear that the discourse of religious discourse has undergone the medicalization during this period, particularly not the traditional medicine, but the Western modern medicine, they were imported to Iran.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, what links your paper to a larger shift that is taking place in revolutionary discourse is how the religious discourse becomes increasingly psychoanalytical and sort of responds to spiritual ills of the nation, rather than in the earlier period was physical illness and curing the physical illness, and engineers became increasingly important in with this spiritual doctors, the spiritual illness, clerics.
Thank you so much.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, how do you compare the concept of martyrdom in post-revolutionary Iran to other countries, like the concept of kamikaze from Japan, and it's state-sponsored propaganda, and how do you compare these state-sponsored propagandas in martyrdom between the countries?
That's a great question. This is a great question. And the one goal, one goal of my project is to kind of approach in comparative perspective. And Japan is actually mentioned in this journal, that the culture of kind of the country shapes the rate of the suicide. And it is somehow understood in terms of modernity, that it compares between the United States and Japan and other countries, that the modern countries kind of decriminalized suicide. And in the United States, it was still a sin to commit suicide. In cultural,
I think it's called euthanasia, right?
Yeah, but kind of. But it was 1960s. So it was before the discussion on medical death was happening, and that the Iran, in this case, very interestingly, considered itself as very modern because it decriminalized suicide and medicalized the suicide. And when we connect this to martyrdom, I don't know, what's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, but they both have something in common, they are both giving up their lives for greater good, right?
We have one online question from Professor Andrea.
Thank you. Right. This is a very important distinction that you've come upon. So it's really interesting, of course, the thesis on the pathologization and the intersection with psychoanalysis or psychiatry at that time. But the discussion that's going on now is probably worthy of really careful study in terms of cross-cultural things, because I know like Azam Tamimi, for example, who has he has a chapter on martyrdom in his book. The title of the book is, it's about Hamas. Anyway, in like other regional contexts, the idea bringing suicide anywhere near that concept of martyrdom, political martyrdom, is is really anathema to the concept. And of course, the closer you get to conservative or orthodox views of the Abrahamic religions, the farther away martyrdom is conceived in terms of its distinction from suicide, because it's fundamentally so different. And there's a few interesting passages that may be useful in your for your study with Giorgio Agamben, his book Remnants of Auschwitz. And in the first chapter, which is quite long, he kind of cuts through any a whole bunch of vocabulary that people often want to use when talking about the camps and all of those issues, saying, no, we're not using the term the Holocaust, it has to be the Shoah. And the absolute refusal of the term martyr, because because of the religiosity in this case, not the idea of suicide, but the sacredness that is associated with that term. And insisting that they can only be considered murder victims or something to that effect, but definitely not martyrs. So anyway, it will be worth unpacking those terms very carefully, because even in medicine, psychiatry, there are books now that are, and the discourse wants to distinguish aspects of suicide, even to take away words like commit suicide, which is kind of, that brings in a type of moralizing religious aspect. So anyway, it's really interesting, and I really enjoyed your talk, as well as the one before, actually all of them. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Eszter Szabo is our next speaker, and she will be speaking on the personalist poetical women, poetry, and revolution. Please.
So the title of my research paper is "The Political is Poetical." I have slightly changed it. It is a reference to a feminist slogan, "The personal is political," attributed to Carol Hanisch, a feminist scholar, which originally emerged in the late 1960s. It seeks to emphasize the connections and mutual impacts between women's personal experiences and larger structural phenomena. To put it another way, that women's personal issues are actually all political issues. So as as I have mentioned, I initially sought to trace the hopes and aspirations of women, and therefore I first thought that the personal is poetical would be a good title to choose. However, my findings have made me change the title to the political is poetical. I have examined the poetry of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And as we have been witnessing a unique woman-led wave of demonstrations filling the streets of Iran and other countries in the world, with protesters chanting the slogan Zan Zendegi Azadi and burning hijabs for the previous 7 months, it is timely to amplify the voices of Iranian women in the current political and social climate by showing how they have historically used poetry as a means of expressing their agency and resistance to oppressive systems. Despite the long history of feminist movements and women's participations in the formation of modern Iran, unfortunately, the mountain of oppression, as the poet Tahara Abadol-Karimi Khalji writes, that women have been trying to destroy has not collapsed. Similarly to the current revolutionary movement, women have played a significant role in many poetical events. So, as Tahara writes, "Bad telekûhe setem, besyar sang zedem, lik, ne sang shekest, ne zarre skûr dûri." You can see and read the translation here. One such historical conjuncture was the 1979 Iranian Revolution, with which the current movement shares many similarities, including the fight for a more democratic country against an oppressive, non-egalitarian system, and the atmosphere unifying various groups of the society holding opposing political views, or the key place of women in the revolutionary movements. In terms of poetry, both of these upheavals are unique because of the eye-catching number of women poets actively contributing to the political events by writing poetry and singing out their hopes, aspirations, and revolutionary ideas. So, to be able to aptly analyze the confluence of women's hopes, poetry, and the political events of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, I basically used Ahmad Karimi Haqqaq's approach and tried to contextualize the poetic products of this period in their social, political, historical milieu. First, I manually collected and analyzed 47 Persian poems written by 21 women poets, which were published in 36 Ferdowsi volumes. One of the most important literary periodicals of the period, literally cultural periodical. Secondly, by examining Persian poetry during this time period, I identified the major themes, recurring topoi, and key notions, which seem to be shared by most of the literary pieces of this revolutionary phase. The time frame of this preliminary investigation stretches roughly from fall 1978 until fall 1979, so it is approximately 1 year, which have allowed me to examine how women's poetry reflected the gradual dissipation of their initial hopes due to the unfavorable development of the revolution. Further to this, the following questions, which you can see on my slide, will be addressed. Who were the main female voices writing during the revolutionary upheavals? What were their personal or political aspirations, and how did they change as a consequence of the historical events? What are the characteristics of the poetics of the revolution? So first, I will briefly outline the history of Persian poetry during the 20th century. Women's poetry has a long history that can be traced back almost to the very beginning of the classical period of Persian poetry, in spite of the fact that their women's literary works have remained invisible, as they have been excluded from the literary canon, except from a very few exceptions, like Forough Farrokhzad or Parvin Sami. The dominance of male poets has been preserved in the literary canon, and women poets had remained scarce in literary treatises until the 19th century. A century later, with the various modernization processes of the constitutional era and the spread of newly established newspapers, journals, female writers started to become more visible as the authority of the tazkiras and divans started to be challenged or were challenged by the modern ways of communication, like the periodicals and the journals. And simultaneously with this, a lot of a poetical paradigm shift took place, which brought about a new literary movement highlighted by the revolutionary poetry of the constitutional era or the revolutionary poetry of Nima Yushij. New voices and themes such as socialist issues began to emerge in women's poetry as well. It is interesting to see that women poets began to write in great numbers. The poetry they produced was solely a political one, except from a few poets like Jale Qaem Maqam or Forough Farrokhzad, whose early distinguishably feminist voice was pioneering. Women's poetry did not display the poet's personal experiences, and it basically revolved around broader socio-political issues. According to Matthew Smith, the key concepts and themes of the Songs of the Freedom composed by women poets of the Constitutional Revolution were Azadi, freedom, barabari, equality, which encapsulating their main aspirations, demonstrate that quote, women were engaged in the democratic discourse of early 20th century Iran, but also aware of their marginal status, both politically and socially, end of quote. Smith asserts that in spite of the fact that the constitutional revolution certainly allowed for female voices to emerge, female authors continue to be marginalized in the scholarly literature. As the Tazkira of Ali Akbar Moshir Salimi, whose front cover you can see here, a 3-volume bibliography of Iranian women poets published in 1956 illustrates well. By the 1960s, the number of women poets have drastically increased. In his book, we can find poets contemporary to Moshir Salimi, like Mahin Askandari or Simin Behbahani, belonging to a major literary current usually referred to as committed literature, Adabiyat Muta'ahad. The literature of the decades prior to the 1979 revolution derived its principles from Marxist ideology, and it intended to work for a greater cause, for the greater cause of liberating people from their serious social and political issues. Hence, the poetry of the 1950s and 60s can be considered as the antecedent of the poetry under study, reaching its climax during the 1979 revolution. A distinct feature of the committed literature was its socialist realism, as Talatov writes, according to which the form of literary work is secondary to its content. A bold emphasis was on heroes and martyrs, which have become fundamental themes both in the literature and public discourses of the revolution and both of the post-revolutionary era. Although the consecutive developmental phases of Persian literature are often pictured as sharply different, as is obvious, one can attest continuity between the ruling concerns of these periods. And now I will turn to the poets themselves. The poetry of the revolution is not only revolutionary because of its political connotations and agenda, but also because of the proliferation of women poets, despite the fact that, similarly to the poetry of previous historical periods, the works of male white writers were still overrepresented in the period because of the revolution. As I have mentioned, I have managed to find 47 poems written by 21 women poets who were somehow creating imprints of the historical events of the period. And in order to not to continue the tradition of their marginalization, I considered important to list their names here. Many of them kept publishing poetry collections and poetry after the revolution as well, either in Iran or in exile, like Firuza Mizani or Simin Behbahani, while others gave up writing and turned towards different professions like Taher Asgarizadeh or Suri Chubak. And due to the evanescent nature of these journals and the revolution as well, we do not have pretty much information about their lives and poetry after the revolution. So the revolutionary writers, following the tradition of their poetic predecessors, were committed to the victory of the revolution and were composing songs to incite the masses to take collective action. In regard to women writers, my findings resemble Talatov's observations in connection with the literary products of the pre-revolutionary era, in which he implicitly includes the literature of the 1979 Iranian Revolution as well. He notes that women's poetry before the revolution is exclusively political, and it lacks a distinct female voice, which can be seen after the revolution. And he further writes that in connection with Simin Behbahani's work, that the dominant discourse she supported, in fact, encouraged women to join men in the Islamic movement in 1978-79. Consequently, women massively participated in this movement, not as women particularly, but as members of the force opposing the Pahlavis. So, as will be shown shortly, it is certainly true that the women's poetry of the revolution was indeed a part of a larger poetical trend, and it lacked that kind of distinct voice which it has now, for example. However, claiming that women were not present in the upheavals of the revolution as women, but only just members, seems to reinforce the language of male dominance and neglectfully evaluate their poetry as again secondary. In my opinion, since the poetry of the constitutional era, let alone the poetry of the revolution, has not yet been studied as much as it is required, more research is needed to confidently make such claims. And now, as I don't have much time, I turn to the poetry itself. It has a lot of inherited symbols from earlier literary periods of Persian poetry, as you can see here. And among these symbols and metaphors, we can divide them actually into 3 or 4 main groups. The first one is related to some kind of natural phenomenon. Jangal, which was the place of guerrilla fights in the forests in the north during the constitutional era and constitutional revolution. Or Moj, yes, I have listed it here. Moj, which is equal to, or wave, which is equal to a social political movement of people, masses of people. Or Setare, which can be a symbol of martyrs as well. And we have spring, seashore, darya, or the travel, safar daryai, and other temporal metaphors like ghurub or shab, night or sunset, which can be both symbols for oppression, and others are related to violence, such as khun, golula, blood, bullet, khanjar, or zanjir, dagger or chain. Nevertheless, the revolution has also brought several inventions in terms of the poetic imagery, and these are placed in some kind of networks of interconnected images, interwoven by their semantics. And one of the general images serving cohesion between these separate images is the notion of Bahar Azadi, spring of freedom, which is frequently can be seen frequently in I don't know 70% of the poems of the period. It is the image of the arrival of spring, which is not a complete invention because it goes back to the Persian poetry, but it can be seen as revolutionary because they have added some additional meanings to it. You can see rain, breath, green fields, and thirsty or thirst as well here, and a picture from one of the Ferdowsi volumes. And I brought here a poem written by Mehrangi Salashur, which displays most of these images. We can see here the Daryai Nilgun, or Dasht Sabz, the green fields and the West Sea, on which, for example, on the West green plains, there are red poppy flowers, Shaqaiq Sur, which are really thirsty. They are waiting for the rain, which symbolizes also the revolution. Other important notions here are the breath of the ground at the end of the poem, Nafas garm zamin, and the notion of scent, buidan. As the usage of the personal pronoun, man, and the first person singular verbs like midavam, faryad mizanam, baran, baran, these suggest that the poet sees herself as someone who has the power to help her homeland, Sarzamin, and its people by running, shouting, and bringing rain. Following the advice of many former Marxist intellectuals, revolutionary poets were emphasizing their duty for calling for social action by singing the songs Khandan and shouting Faryad Zadan in order to liberate people from the Qafas al-Zulm, or the cage of oppression. The poet's self-concept as torch bearers was in line with the figure of the martyr, who was also seen as a person who could guide people and spark a revolution. With the killings or martyrdom of popular Marxist intellectuals and writers such as Samad Behrangi or Khosrow Golsorkhi, who was a Marxist intellectual poet, the concept of the martyr reached its climax during the revolution due to its centrality in the political discourses of the time. For example, Khosrow Golsorkhi's trial and death were thematized in several Ferdowsi volumes, and I have found a couple of poems as well written in memory of him. One of these is composed by a poet called Shohala Golsorkhi, who might have had some kind of a familiar relationship to him, but I haven't been able to find any information on her identity. The figure of the martyrs appears in different forms like shahid or golesor, red flower, either poppy flower or a tulip, lala, and it usually grows on green fields, dashtcha sabz, or in beautiful gardens like bagh, bahcha. And this is a very quite famous poem of Simin Behbahani, which was analyzed in Asghar Sayed Bohrab's recent monograph on martyrdom and mysticism. He provides a detailed and very insightful analysis of this poem and discusses it as a war poem, though its date of creation and its revolutionary slogan, like the title, Shahid Qalb Tarikh Ast, connects it to the revolution itself. The poem was published shortly after the victory of the revolution, and more precisely, the attack of the US Embassy and the start of the executions of the Shah's leading supporters on 19 February 1979, yes, maybe 19th. While it still has an overall optimistic view of the future, the last line of the poem, Ari Nasima Insan Hargaz Muattar Nist, a breeze such as this is never perfumed, breaks its auspicious vision by implying the bloody and brutal aspects of martyrdom. The revolutionary poetry's initial hopeful tone and cheery imagery was gradually replaced by a more desperate voice and darker images along the course of the revolutionary events, as much as the metaphors of spring, the scent of freedom, or the fresh air of liberation were all sanguine. The poems published after March 1979 display the waning optimism of the revolutionary poets. In the introduction, we have already seen one examples of these, which I will repeat here shortly. We can conclude that the revolution wasn't just a political transition, but it can be seen as a poetical transition as well between the pre-revolutionary political poems of women and the post-revolutionary era, which can be characterized by the personal poetry of women. So that's why I basically changed my title to the Political is Poetical, because all of these poems that we have just seen are political. And we can see this gradual change to personal poetry even during the revolution. So that's
very good. Thank you very much, Eszter. We have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, sorry for it.
Please. Yes, Mohammed.
Yeah, so my question is regarding women's poetry. Is there somewhat of an interrelation between nationalistic women's poetry dating to the revolutionary period and men's poetry? Is there some sort of relation between the two, or is women's poetry completely distinct when compared to poetry by men?
As I have mentioned, the women's poetry can be placed in the bigger framework of Persian poetry. So these political poems of women were following a bigger kind of trend. And these symbols were shared by both women and men of that period. But after the revolution, a distinct feminist voice just began to emerge, and women just started to embrace the feminist literary discourses. So yeah, the Iranian Revolution was a big distraction in this sense.
Other questions?
It was a bit long, sorry for that, but I had so many poems which were really, I don't know, interesting, like this one. I really like.
No, this is awesome poem. And also the one was Salahshur. روی علف‌های تر لمیدن، غلتیدن، خندیدن.
Yeah,
sort of,
yeah, it is really,
it does have that feminine.
yeah, yes, yeah.
That would be really good to capture too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so my main conclusion is that these poems and the political poetry of women just need to be
Yep.
discussed and researched more, because it is really easy to say that, okay, the main symbols are the same with the male poetry, but there are certain layers which can be seen as
Right.
feminist voices or
Yeah.
something like that.
Very good.
Can I just also mention
Yes.
something? With the poems by Simin Behbahani, Shahid Qalb Tarikh هست. When I look at it, like I found so many terms that usually can be found in a state propaganda poems that
Right.
they write about the martyrs and
Right.
the ones.
Right. Very good. All right, our next speaker, Mohammad Mian, and Mohammad is discussing from royal dictatorship to theocratic autocracy. Mohammad.
Thank you, Patrick. So yeah, basically to begin my presentation, my research took a look at the transition between the Islamic Republic as well as the previous Pahlavi dynasty's rule, and I tried to relate that to in terms of institutions of autocracy, not only political but also societal. So that's basically what I'll get into this presentation, and my analysis here will show that there was indeed a continuity between the modes of autocracy which shaped the Shah's reign well into the reign of Khomeini. So yeah, despite Khomeini advocating for a change to the political scene, it didn't really do much to change the autocratic nature of the government. So introduction. So as I mentioned, there existed continuity between the autocratic modes of governance of the Shah's reign and the Islamic Republic, and then this actually persisted well into the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution. And as I mentioned previously, there were autocratic political and societal institutions which were maintained in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution. So an example of this was the Savak. So many people may not consider the Savak to have continued in any form into the Islamic Republic, but nonetheless, my research here will show that it's very similar to the Ministry of Security and Intelligence and in the role it played within Iranian society and continues to play. So regarding the institutionalized position of autocratic rule, so basically, based on my research, the Shah's role as an autocratic figure in Iranian society was maintained by Khomeini. So after the Shah was overthrown, Khomeini took up the role of the supreme leader, which was basically just a continuation of a political leader who, as my analysis will show, who controlled Iranian society and placed the majority of power in the hand of a single figure. So according to my research, based on the readings I've done on Michael Axworthy's revolutionary Iranian piece, he discusses how the Walayat-e-Faqih was very similar to the Shah's position in Iranian society. So the Walayat-e-Faqih was basically the leader of Iranian society through which the Shah, through which Khomeini established his governance. So yeah, that's interesting. So basically there's a continuity between the Shah's position as a monarch and the Wali-e-Faqih as the guider for Iranian society as he is known today. So again, as I mentioned, the near absolute authority was placed under the control of one man in both examples, and thus there existed continuity between the autocratic modes of government which defined the Pahlavi dynasty and the Khomeiniist Islamic Republic. So yeah. So to begin, I'd like to provide a bit of contextual background. So basically, Oriana Fallaci was a famous journalist who interviewed the three men, which is interesting. So I basically took a look at her three interviews with the Shah, Khomeini, and Bazargan. So up first, the Shah, basically, he claimed that his government, in the interview dating in 1973, he claimed that his government was a socialist state like the Nordic countries and was more democratic than Western nations. So in this interview, the Shah really downplayed accusations made against his government by Oriana Fallaci in the sense that she claimed that it was too authoritarian and there was not enough freedom for the people. But he, in contrast to this, claimed that this was not the case, and that in fact the people of Iran were very much free under his guidance, and actually that his nation was much more democratic than Western countries. And also in terms of socialism, he claimed it to be a leader among socialism, even going further to claim that the model of socialism promoted by the Shah's government was better, much better than that in the Nordic countries. So after this, in 1979, after the overthrow of the Shah, Balachi interviewed two men, Badr Khan and Khomeini. So Badr Khan was basically the first prime minister of Iran, and Khomeini under the Islamic Republic, and Khomeini was the supreme leader, as I mentioned. So in Badr Khan's interview, he emphasized the weak position within Iranian society and emphasized that actual authority was with Khomeini. So he pretty much said that I don't have much control over the government, and this was controversial. So he tried to downplay the authoritarian nature of his government, but nonetheless, he did say that his position was very weak. And in contrast, Khomeini considered his government, much like the Shah's, to be as democratic as possible under an Islamic system of governance. And actually, much like the Shah, he also claimed that it was more democratic than Western nations. So that's interesting that both men tried to place an emphasis on the modes of governance within their governments, which somehow contrasted and compared with one another, but wanted to place their governments above Western democracies in a sense to put forth that their institutions were not as autocratic as claimed. So here is an image of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. So he reigned over Iran from 1941, which was the result of a coup d'etat that overthrew his father. So his father abdicated in the aftermath of the Russian and British invasion of Iran, and he reigned from 1941 to until he was overthrown in 1979 by Khomeini's Islamic Revolution. So here is Khomeini, and my focus is primarily on the early years of the Islamic Revolution, so not into the present day. So I don't really take a look at anything further than 1984. Nonetheless, he reigned from 1979 to 1989. So here is Mahdi Badr Khan. So he was the first prime minister under Khomeini, and he basically resigned because he didn't like the direction of the government. But nonetheless, he was a pivotal player in the early political scene of the Islamic Republic. So an interesting aspect which highlights the continuity of the modes of autocracy from the Shah's reign into the Pahlavi period with the party system. So this is extensively discussed and delved upon by Michael Axworthy, but nonetheless, I'd like to say that what's interesting here is that the party system under the Shah's rule was characterized by political parties which had to be approved by him from 1955 to 1975. So these parties were at the gist of it under the Shah's control, and they actually had to be approved by him. And so again, they were under his influence, and examples of this were the Party of Nationalists and the People's Party. So both of these parties were sponsored by the Shah, so it didn't matter who ended up winning in the end, because both parties were under the direct influence of the Shah. So what's interesting is that in 1975, the Shah abolished the multi-party system and replaced it with the Rustakhi's party, which remained in control of Iran until 1979. So this was also under the direct influence of the Shah, and this shows that the Shah actually had the final say in political matters, because if he didn't, he wouldn't just randomly transform society into one which was a one-party system, which he did in 1975. So regarding the Rustakhi's party, it remained in control of Iran from 1975 to 1979, and the Shah was the patron of the party, and it was his party for the most part. So regarding the party system in the Islamic Republic, so this is where it gets interesting. So you see that under the Islamic Republic, the multi-party system has been maintained. So again, this is discussed in Axworthy at length, but he basically tries to say that the current party system is very much reflective of a mode of governance which is centralized around the authority of the supreme leader, much like it was during the Shah's reign. And basically, again, Khomeini had to approve the party. So this wasn't the case for the first election in 1979. But after that, Khomeini has since instituted an interesting party system, which he promoted the parties which took place in this election, and he had to approve them. And again, they were much like during the Shah's reign, they were under the influence of the supreme leader. So what this meant is that the supreme leader had the final say in nearly all Iranian internal political affairs and matters, much like the Shah. So here is one of the leading parties of the early Islamic Republic, the Islamic Republican Party, and this was personally sponsored by Khomeini, and it lasted from 1979 to 1987. So another interesting aspect I want to discuss here now is the role of the prime minister under the Shah. So basically what this was during the Shah's reign, the Iranian prime minister largely gained power with the Shah's support and endorsement, and this prime minister served as the nominal head of state with the Shah possessing actual power, and the Shah could have either accepted or rejected the prime minister based on a personal choice. So it was up to him who became the prime minister and who did. And basically, communist and leftist candidates were rarely elected to positions of political authority under the Shah. So here is one of the Shah's leading political figures during the later part of the Pahlavi dynasty, Amir Abbas Hawida. So basically, he was approved by the Shah and supported by the Shah, but ironically, towards the end, he was actually imprisoned by the Shah just before the Iranian Revolution, and he would end up being executed by Khomeini in the aftermath. So again, this is very similar to the system of the president of the Islamic Republic. So basically, this is a position that's contested between candidates that had to be approved by Khomeini, and it reflects that the actual power day with the supreme leader, much like it did with the Shah, how the prime minister had to be approved by under the Shah's guidance. And basically, the earliest presidents were from Khomeini, the inner circle. So an example of this is Abul Banisafar, who just passed away in 2011, but he was the first president of the Islamic Republic, and he was appointed by Khomeini. Later on, he would actually end up getting into an argument and having disagreements with Khomeini, so he would be exiled. But nonetheless, early on, he was very much a part of this early Islamic Republican political scene. So what can be concluded from is that the presidential system was very similar to the prime ministers under the Pahlavi dynasty. So again, there existed a continuity between the modes of authoritarianism that existed, particularly the political parties as well as the institution of autocracy, the Wali Faqih and the Shah, and also the political parties and the prime ministers and presidents. So this is an image of Abul Frotan. So a final thing that I just want to take a look at here was the continuation of societal institutions which allowed the Shah and Khomeini to exert their influence over Iranian society. So an example of this is the Sawak. So basically, the Sawak was also known as the Sara Molaee Etalat wa Amniyat-e-Keshwar, or intelligence and security organization of the country, and basically it served to further the power and control over Iranian society under the Shah. So it was known for its intelligence operations against dissent within Iran, and basically it would survive and be absorbed by Khomeini's Ministry of Intelligence and Security. So this is discussed by Ghulam Reza Afghani in one of his research work, and basically he mentions how around 4,000 to 6,000 individuals were under the were employed by the Sawak, and basically that another report basically on the Sawak and the Islamic Republic Ministry of Security and Intelligence and how there's a continuity there will also be discussed. So this is an image of the Sawak. So you can see that it's a samurg, and basically it reflects, it's basically an ancient Persian symbol. So basically it's to show that this was a state-sanctioned and perhaps even ancient institution within Iranian society, which is interesting. So regarding this, in 2012, the Library of Congress published a report on the Ministry of Intelligence and Security as well as the Islamic Republican Revolutionary Guard Corps. So basically what they showed is that the Ministry of Intelligence and Security has maintained autocratic rule within Iran, and basically there was a transition where the individuals who were employed under the leadership of the Sawak continue to function in Iranian society under the control of the Ministry of Intelligence and Security. So on the ground level, very little change among those who were employed within the Sawak and the later is the Ministry of Intelligence and Security. So what they showed is that there was a degree of continuity between the two, and both were institutions within society which served to further the forms of autocracy of Khomeini and the Shah. So here's the logo of the present Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and this is from 1983 to the present. And this is the logo for the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, and you can see that again. It may very much has motifs where it's trying to show that they're much like the Shah's motifs appeal to the pre-Islamic heritage. This is more of an Islamic resistance movement, and you can see that it has the symbol of the on the Islamic Republican flag at the top. So that's interesting as well. So the final thing I wanted to discuss here was broken promises. So the Shah and Khomeini, there existed this interesting development that both governments broke promises they made to the Iranian people. So firstly, the Shah failed to adhere to promises made which went against his secular policy. So basically, he made promises that he would allow greater religious representation in the Iranian public sphere. And also, the fact that he did not adhere to these promises led to the Iranian Revolution. So again, in a similar way, Khomeini did not adhere to the promises that were made regarding the complete abolition of the one-party system and free and fair elections, which was similar to the promises made by the Shah. And basically, these promises were also not kept by Khomeini, as I mentioned, and this ultimately led to the alienation of women in the public sphere, and their support turned towards more radical elements that oppose the Islamic government, such as the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. So what's interesting here, between both Khomeini's reign and that of the Shah, you can see that there was this dichotomy of broken promise, where they did not adhere to the promises they made to the Iranian people. So here is an image of anti-Shah protests in 1979. So again, you can see that a lot of people turned out for these protests, and there was a lot of anti-Shah sentiment among the Iranian people because the Shah did not adhere to the promises he made. So here are women protesting Khomeini, and you can see again, this is from 1979, and the reason they were protesting was because the Khomeini did not keep the promises he made in regards to greater women's rights for the Iranian women, as well as other political based rights for women, especially increasing their participation in the public sphere. So that's interesting as well. So regarding my conclusions, basically the autocratic modes of government which characterized the Shah's rule survived into the post-Pahlavi period. And for this reason, both the Shah and Khomeini institutionalized autocratic modes of governance in Iran, which is interesting. So basically the party system persisted into the Islamic Republic from the Pahlavi period. So despite Khomeini advocating for political change, he nonetheless adhered to the Shah's party system for the most part. Though what is interesting is he did not completely abolish all parties and turn it into a single party system like the Shah did in 1975. So that's an interesting aspect. So basically, the prime minister and presidents played the same role in Iranian society in the Pahlavi and Islamic Republican period, as both had to be approved by the Shah and Khomeini respectively. And also many autocratic institutions survived the Shah's overthrow, such as the Moist and IRGC, which were the direct successors to the SWAC. So the institutions to which the Shah and Khomeini enforced their autocracy remained in place. And finally, the Shah and Khomeini did not adhere to promises made to Iranians, primarily to women. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
All right, thank you, Mohammed. Very good. Dr. Please go.
Thank you very much, Brother Mohammed. You had an excellent presentation, and I really enjoyed it. But the question that I have is, what do you draw from this comparison that you see the two regimes, even the regime which was the outcome of an revolution, has the same characteristic of the Shah regime? So is this point to a structural problem in that society, or it is a cultural issue? So why it ending up, producing the same kind of regime? And also, I go one step further in, based on this experience, how you predict or you think that the future movement and revolution will not again produce the same political structure that we saw?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I would say that this was basically more of a structural problem that was basically the structure of the Islamic Republic mirrors the Shah government, because I would say that it was built on the ruins of the other. So in a sense, it was a continuation in the sense that it attempted to address the political issues of the people and institutionalize autocracy under the leadership of one man. So that's what I would say. And to answer your second question, in order to make sure this doesn't happen again, I think Iranians need to completely get rid of the old system and begin a new and establish a system which is more akin to Western democracy, as opposed to just forming another autocratic institution that did happen with the Islamic Republic.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Yes,
I
please.
just need to make one minor correction. Like you said, like some institutions survived the overthrow of Shah, such as IRGC. IRGC was actually formed after the revolution.
Yeah, I meant, but it was nonetheless a product of the pre-existing SAWAK systems that were in place. So I didn't mention this, but basically the SAWAK secret police somehow played somewhat of a similar role in Iranian society and as the IRGC. But you're right, the IRGC did come after, but the Mois continued on the institutions that were established by the SAWAK within Iranian society.
Any other questions?
No,
Mohammed, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And our next speaker is Abdul Frotan, exporting the Iranian Revolution to Afghanistan. And after Mr. Frotan, we have another surprise paper that is on, the title is
Moving in Leotards, disciplining Iranian bodies and minds through the station of Ballet.
Moving in Leotards, leotard Iranian women from 1930s onward. Yeah, very good. Thank you.
As we all may know, the final objective of the Islamic Revolution was to initiate what Ramazani called an ideological crusade, which sought to spread Islam's revolutionary message within the oppressed Muslim world. Therefore, exporting the revolution was considered to be a key component of Iranian foreign policy by many of Khomeini's disciples, and its significance was even recognized by virtue of its inclusion within the Islamic Republic Constitution in its 11th chapter. So first, within my research, I discussed the theoretical underpinning of the exporting the revolution, as well as its practical implementation by the Islamic regime. I argued that although Suduri Inqilab, or expecting the revolution, was a key tenet of Iran's revolutionary ideology, it quickly morphed into a vehicle for the regime to pursue Iran's long-desired goals of attaining regional supremacy, combating foreign domination, and maintaining the regime interest abroad. An example of that is Iran's assertion of control over the island of Abu Musa in 1992, and its firmness on the matter, since they are not really tied to the exporting the revolution or to the implementation of supranationalism as envisioned by the clerics. In fact, the Islamic Republic's policy toward the island mirrors the Shah policy in 1971 and 1972, which was based on concerns about security in the Persian Gulf, as well as the national interest of Iran. As Ali Ansari, a professor of modern history, insists, quote, nationalism is the determining ideology of modern Iran, unquote. Although modern Iran's ideological landscape has fluctuated in terms of the shift from a dynastic and dictatorial constitutional monarchy to the present Islamic Republic, the championing of Iranian nationalism remained constant across regimes. Ansari also emphasizes the significance of myths that are particular to the historical experience of Iran, as playing a key role in supporting Iran's pervasive ideology of nationalism and result in motivating action based upon its pre-Islamic history. Such myths are argued to have assisted with shaping Iranian nationalism and by extension shaping Iranian behavior.
According to MacLeod Robinson, there are two everlasting myths that underpins Iran's behavior in terms of its regional foreign policy. First, the myth of Greek civilization, which Ansari describes in detail, relating it to the Iranian nationalism. And second is the myth of foreign domination, which originates from the scholarly work of Mian and Ramazan. However, after the 1979 revolution, the myth of Greek civilization was Islamicized by the introduction of theory of al-Qura, which is nationalistic in its nature, as it also emphasizes Iran's preeminence in exclusivity, which in Ansari words most commonly associated with nationalistic ideologies. According to Babai Zarech, quote, in Khomeini's view, Iran is the al-Qura of the world of Islam and the primary locus of pure Muhammadan Islam. Therefore, defense of it is defense of Islam in the Quran and not one limited to the mere territory, unquote. The al-Qura in this sense is considered to be a role model of sorts for Ummah that personifies the ideal Islamic state inclusive of Islamic government embedded in the position of the Rahbar, who is considered to hold responsibility for the entire Ummah, regardless of geographical and political boundaries. On the other hand, the broader Ummah is responsible for aiding the al-Qura or exemplary Islamic government, perhaps the Wilayat Faqih, against any perils that may arise and threaten it. Considering this theory, one's understanding of the concept of the exporting the revolution can be reassessed due to Iran's position as an exemplar, as according to Ali Falahi-Nejad, if exporting the revolution and preserving Iran as al-Qura come into conflict, Iran's self-defense should take priority. Overall, there are three key goals that can be identified in relation to the regime exporting the revolution. First, it serves as a form of defense for the Islamic Republic in short term. Secondly, it assists with the maintenance of security for the Islamic Republic within the immediate Persian Gulf, as well as the international sphere. Finally, in the longer term, it can be said to facilitate working towards the vision of establishing a world under which, according to Ramazani, is premised upon, quote, the umbrella of Islamic justice, unquote. Nonetheless, in the first decade after the revolution, there were recognizable digression from the core tenets of Khomeini's philosophy, as pragmatism trumped the radical elements of his philosophy. As a result, the fundamental tenets of Khomeini's doctrine were altered, including the exporting the revolution. Generally, three types of problem challenged the Iranian leadership, which include the Iran-Iraq war and Iran-related isolation, an extended economic downturn, and increasing nationalism, and clashes within revolutionary bureaucracy itself. The related devaluation of exporting the revolution is merely one facet of the overall regime repositioning. Further, according to Ramazani, the primary targets for exporting the revolution include 4 countries or geographical areas: Afghanistan, Lebanon, the Persian Gulf, and the Central Asia, including the Soviet Caucasus. Afghanistan in particular has held a notable position since its independence within Iran's political culture due to shared values. Afghanistan has also been significant to the strategic position of dominant powers, which has led to usurpation of power in Afghanistan as well as, to some extent, Iran. Now that we have an understanding of the theoretical framework of the revolution, in a sense, as to what the actual implementation by Tehran look like, we can further explore how policies of exporting revolution to Afghanistan have been formulated and implemented. Exporting the revolution to Afghanistan can be deemed an Islamicized version of Iran's national ideology that primarily focused upon the elevation of Iran's regional position, as well as combating foreign powers' influences there. In addition to being neighboring country, Afghanistan has also been conducive to the use of soft power by Iran due to common values shared amongst the nation, including culture, language, religion, and anti-Western resistant ideology. Iran has also had the ability to levy considerable hard power, including economic, military, and political tools to achieve its objectives. Soft power specifically is an ability, according to Joseph Nye, that empowers a party, quote, to get what they want through attraction rather than coercion or payments, unquote. However, as Shahram Akbarzadeh insists, quote, Iran's hard power strategies impacted its soft power appeal in Afghanistan, unquote. In his view, quote, the projection of soft power by countries such as Iran or Saudi Arabia target states that are undergoing political instability, violent conflicts, and division along ethnic and sectarian fault lines, unquote. Although it may be natural to infer that Iran would focus on leveraging its soft power, which is rooted in an array of linkage with Afghanistan, the reality is that Iran has failed to capture the mind of its targets. Hence, a critical view of Iran is actually the norm among people in Afghanistan, including the Shia sect, whom one may think would be well suited to holding a favorable view of Iran based on religion ties alone. Generally, both imbalance in hard power between Afghanistan and Iran, as well as Tehran's contradictory policies, stemmed from strategic concern, internal factional politics, and ideological inclinations in steel since 1979 can be identified as the two primary causes of Iran's poor footing in Afghanistan. Now I will briefly discuss how these contradictory factors negatively impacted Afghanistan. A strategic concern. Iran has had a historical suspicion toward the presence of great powers in the region, which has in turn shaped its foreign policies toward Afghanistan, including attempts to exporting the revolution to this country. During the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah, Iran held an important role in the region as the country was close ally to the United States during the Cold War. Iran was essentially able to capitalize upon the fear existing in the United States relating to the Soviet and their related expansion of communism within the region, which could potentially stymie both economic and security interests of United States. When the Soviet-backed People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan was able to seize power through the installation of military coup in April 1978, the Shah-assisted opposition group, which countered the regime in Kabul, as he believed this development posed a threat to not only his country, but also the broader geographical region of the Middle East and South Asia. After the Shah's downfall, the new Islamic leadership continued its policy of aiding anti-Kabul opposition forces, as it always opposed the occupation of Afghanistan by foreign armies. However, the new Islamic regime made use of the Afghan card as a way to purchase military equipment during the Iran-Iraq war, get Moscow to compromise and contain the number of arms that would be supplied by the Soviet to Iraq, oppose the growing threat from the United States, and quash pro-Moscow activists within the Iran, while Khomeini was in the process of solidifying power within Iran. Iran's inconsistent policies and support for different groups that ended up opposing and even fighting one another revealed a flaw in its approach toward Afghanistan that ultimately weakened its position. In contrast, another regional player, Pakistan, has focused its efforts on one particular faction group. Pakistan approach greatly differ from the Iran's and appears to be more consistent in its form. The Taliban ascendance to power for the first time in 1996 was the worst possible outcome for Iran, as it was an extremist Sunni group, and this development dealt Iran an injurious blow. Factional politics. The policies relating to exporting the revolution to Afghanistan were also impacted by factionalism, which characterized the Khomeini era and intensified further after the Ayatollah's death. Generally, there were two organizations that could be argued to have played the primary role in facilitating Iran's execution of its foreign policy toward the Afghanistan resistance when the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan. At the military level, it was Revolutionary Guard that provided military supplies and training. The Iranian Foreign Ministry facilitated arrangement of meeting between Shia parties in the Soviet Union, as well as Shia parties and Sunni group based in Pakistan. One of the consequences of factional politics in Iran was it caused a negative impact in Afghanistan. For example, in Hazarajat, it is the central Afghanistan, and it is where the main center for Hazara Shia. As Nematullah Ibrahimi demonstrates, quote, the weakening of a patron in Iran could result in the reduction of the level of financial military supplies, unquote. For example, Ayatollah Muntaziri lent assistance to the Nahdati Islamic group. However, aid to this group decreased quite significantly after Muntaziri was marginalized in the mid-1980s in Iran. On the other hand, the Pasdaran Jihad-e-Islami Afghanistan, the army of the guardian of the revolution in Afghanistan, was able to maintain their influential status due to long-lasting support from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard in Iran. Further, the internal power struggle among official and clerical circles in the post-revolutionary Iran even led to the production of non-uniform and disordered foreign policies, which even led to the fragmentation and factionalism of Khomeini's group in Afghanistan. The last part is the ideological inclination. Ideological inclination is another important factor which has played a role in determining the Islamic Republic policies aimed at exporting the revolution to Afghanistan. It was the Shia Hazara inhabited central Afghanistan where the Iranian ideological crusade mainly unfolded in the middle of the 1980s and has been perceived by some as the second successful example of exporting the revolution abroad after Lebanon. Before the infiltration of pro-Khomeini group, a Shura Council had been established there to act as a local government after the Soviet-backed government forces were pushed out from the area in 1979. Even though Sheikh Ali Beheshti, who was the leader of this council and a follower of Ayatollah Khomeini in Iraq, was viewed as politically weak, he was nonetheless able to put in place an independent administration that included both bureaucracy and infantry. In spite of that, Tehran limited its assistance to the Shia parties that were close to Iran and the revolutionary ideology, even though they were small in number at the beginning of 1982. With the Iranian support, the Khomeini groups, the Nasr and Pasdaran, waged a bloody war against the Shura, and by the year 1968, control of the whole area of Hazarajat was essentially in their hands. Oliver Roy, a French political scientist professor who visited the area around that time, found out that, quote, a genuine civil war had developed, unquote. Since then, with the assistance of Iranian, the pro-Khoei school influence became diminished. Loyalty to Khomeini's school was skewed by making it a condition to receive assistance. And loyalty entailed allegiance to Khomeini's authority. However, the separate Khomeini's network, which had been brought together after the defeat of their common enemies, started to break apart quite rapidly, resulting another violent confrontation amongst them, which marked the second civil war in Hazarajat. As the author John Heron Grevenier also insists, quote, the ideologization of the resistance, the transformation of the clergy to political leaders and the rise of religiously oriented resistance group organized at grassroots level has led to a pluralization in the Hazara society, which have resulted in severe conflicts, unquote. Overall, the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was utilized by Iran to advance its own interest, as opposed to committing to helping to support groups such as Shia Hazara for the sake of assisting with their fight for their freedom and equality. Iran simply utilized them in a manner that would assist with the defense of Iran's objectives in the region, which were both ideological and political in nature. Overall, Iran's ideological crusade and other contradictory policies have negatively impacted Hazara and Shia group by stoking division and internal conflict among them to the extent that their political and military achievement were diminished. And one last thing that I would like to mention, that even Iran was not able to achieve its own objective, whatever it was, nationalistic or hegemonic, due to its conflicting policies. And in my research in detail, I focused on these issues, but I didn't want to exceed the time limit that we had, and I'd like to end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Questions, please, Mohammed?
Yeah, I have a question. So regarding the
Can you loud, please, because my hearing, it's almost my sleeping time.
okay, so
I want one more paper.
I had a question. Based on your research, and I know you looked at the Iran-Iraq war as well, but I was wondering, were there parallels between the Iranian government's attempts to spread and export the revolution to nearby countries such as Iraq and Pakistan in comparison to Afghanistan? Were there parallels there that you found? Or?
I didn't get, sorry, I apologize. Can you slowly repeat it? Or if someone else.
Yeah, have you done any comparison between the Iranian intervention in Afghanistan and support for various groups with that of, let's say, Iraq, and one could say also in Lebanon? How does it differ?
Yes, actually, very good question, Brother Mohammed. Thank you.
Always ask good questions.
Yes. So, in one way, I would like to say that, yes, we can see lots of similarities. Same goal was pursued in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. But in some ways, there is difference between Iranian approach to Lebanon versus their approach to Afghanistan. For example, in Lebanon, they focused only on investing on one party, which is Hezbollah Lebanon. And also, we should not forget that there is not, Lebanon is not very complicated as Afghanistan. In Shia, there is makeup in terms of population, if I'm not wrong, make up the majority of religious sect there. And even I heard that other parties employed their soldiers among the Shia. So Iran had a potential to invest on that one, and it got very result. And it is the first example of the exporting the revolution, to a outside country. In Afghanistan, Iran also had potential. There was Shia groups. They were very united. As in my presentation, I mentioned there was a council, a shura, that could roll all over the region. And actually, Iran tried the same policy, because I remember that when they went to Lebanon, they tried to do a surgery with an amal, harakat amal, and bring a child out of them as a Hezbollah. In Afghanistan, they used the same strategy because they wanted to create a similar Hezbollah type in Afghanistan, but they failed because they were not very uniform action. Different parties were involved, and also there was complexity in Afghanistan society. Yeah, so there was lots of things. I think there are similarities and also there are differences. The big difference in Afghanistan is that Iran invested on many groups, Sunni radicals, Shia radicals, and also nationalist groups, and it failed, to get any result. And this is why Iran's role is even now in Afghanistan is very weak.
That's very interesting. Very good. Barakat, please.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. I've got a question. Now, part of your presentation, from what I got was that that the role of Iran in Afghanistan was to help different factions, and those different factions, they did fight within themselves, and I think that is one of the critiques of the help in Afghanistan to the Shia community. Now, later on, when the different factions within the different groups, different religious groups, they joined and they became the unity party, the Hizbi Wahdat. What do you think is the role of Iran in forming? Do you think it was more internal politics that they came together, or do you think Iran had a role in because from outside always it is said that it is again it is a puppet, it is Iranian puppet, even to the last when Hizb Wahdat was in power during the time in West Kabul. Do you think, what is your opinion on that? What is the role of Iran?
Thank you very much. This is a very good question. As far as I think, and also I was witness, at the time when the Wahdat formed inside Afghanistan, Iran was supporting an alliance of 8 groups in Tehran. Wahdat was a movement, an internal movement from within Afghanistan Shia and Hazara communities to unite in order to combat the threat that they were facing from the parties which were based in Pakistan, and they were ignored by them. So it was a very, very strong indigenous movement in order to get their right. And Iran first was very reluctant to support them. And later on, when Iran realized that the alliance of 8 parties does not have any center in Afghanistan, they changed their policy and they started to work with the Wahdat party and to welcome them. And as you know, since Iran, as I mentioned in my presentation, also Iran has a very strong hard power. So they try to employ some people within, some element within the Wahdat party to work for them in Iran. But as far as Kabul is concerned, to make the, it's very brief and short, toward the end of the life of Abdul Ali Mazari, which is my topic of research, Wahdat split it. One part of Wahdat under the Akbari was very close to Iran and also very close to Jamiyat-e-Islami in Masood. And the main part, which was Abdul Ali Mazari, distanced themselves and they focused their fight in getting the right of Hazara people, beside right of the other linguistic group in Afghanistan. And at that point, Iran was even in the, we can see in the memories of Hashemi Rafsanjani, when Rabbani visited to Iran, Rafsanjani was saying in his memory, it is a good idea if we remove Mazari and we put Akbari in his place. So we cannot have more strong proof than this.
Thank you much. Any other questions? Online, in person? Excellent presentation. Very, very good. And we have one final paper, and the speaker is Yasamin Jameh, and she's speaking on moving in leotards, disciplining Iranian bodies and minds through the staging of ballet, 1930 to 1979.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Yasamin Jameh. It's a privilege, really, to partake in this amazing symposium. As Professor Tavakoli already mentioned, the title of my research paper is Moving in Leotards, Disciplining Iranian Bodies and Minds Through the Staging of Ballet. And I will be looking at the period around 1930 to 1979. So this is a complicated topic, includes a lot of layers, and due to the specific nature of the performing arts and particularly dance in Iran, it's very hard to study. And I will get into that. So the performing arts like music, dance, theater have had a precarious existence in Iran for a long time. This is not to say that Iran does not have a rich history of performing arts. No, quite the contrary. Iran has an expansive performing arts culture that traces its origin to the antiquity. However, due to complex political and socio-religious reasons, Iranian performing artists, like musicians and dancers, have traditionally been forced to practice their craft in informal, private settings, and were traditionally stigmatized by being associated with frivolity and even overt sexuality. This animosity towards dance, music, and by extension, dance too, because music without dance, dance without music is nothing. First there's the music and then there's the dance, can be attributed to roughly the 16th century specifically, because the 16th century, as Hormuz Farhad notes, was the period of Shiite ascendancy. It is assumed that the perspective attitude of Shiite clerics and their measure of dominance in the social affairs of the country may have largely been responsible for this musical stagnation. And that lasted up until the early 20th century, when rapid modernization efforts undertaken by especially the Pahlavi dynasty changed that, and there was a renewed interest and vigor towards studying the performing arts and dance. This essay will specifically focus on the development of Iranian concert dance, so not the dance that you will see in the Mehmonis, where people just dance casually to the whatever music, maybe even someone is playing it live. No, it's concert dance, so stage dance where it is performed in a theater, formal performance of dance. I will be focusing from roughly 1930 until 1979, but we'll also briefly explore the dance culture of the late Qajar period for context. And in recounting this history, of course, I'll have some overlap with music, because as I mentioned, the two arts are inseparable. And those arts developed concurrently under the Pahlavi period. So like the Tehran Opera Orchestra, the Iranian National Ballet Company, they were all sister projects housed under the Rudaki Hall, and they were all generously sponsored by the Ministry of Culture and Arts under the auspices of Minister Mirdad Pahbud, in an effort to basically acculturate Iranians to Western modes of artistic expression. Part of this paper will argue that the Pahlavi's government's efforts to acculturate Iranians to Western artistic modes was not merely about bringing ballet, opera, or concert music to Iran, but also entailed the cultivation of disciplined spectatorship among the broader Iranian population, besides the select few who were already Western-oriented. This paper defines disciplined spectatorship as the ability of audiences to remain silent for the duration of a performance and focus solely on the performers on stage. Another reason why Iranian modernists, with the vigorous support of the Pahlavi government, sought ballet specifically, out of all other dance genres, is to, showcase and elevate the already existing indigenous vernacular Iranian dance forms, is very telling of their ideals. As dance scholar Jennifer Holmans has noted, ballet is an art of high ideals and self-control, in which proportion, grace stand for an inner truth and elevated state of being. Ballet, moreover, is an etiquette as much as an art, layered with centuries of courtly convention and codes of civility and politeness. That's why in periodicals and a lot of modernist nationalists and periodicals, beginning in the 1930s, kept advocating for ballet in order to elevate the Iranian dances, especially like Motrebi dances and Motreb, because the biggest form of like organization, I don't know if you can call it organization, but basically people who did performing arts were mostly the Motrebs in Iran in the Qajar period. And they didn't like that. They thought that was degenerate, pre-modern, and that ballet needed to be introduced to, balletize their dances and their musics and put them on the national stage. So ballet was everything that Iranian dance, especially those performed by Motrebi or minstrel bands, was not. Ballet's movements were methodical, disciplined, and aristocratic, as much as Motrebi Iranian dance movements were immethodical or improvisational, gaudy, and licentious. To further establish why ballet was so admired by Iranian nationalist modernists, this paper will position it in the larger discourse among modernist nationalist intellectuals of the Pahlavi period, who saw Iranians' physical health as a prerequisite for a progressive nation. There have been numerous pieces of academic literature on how improving the Iranian race and reversing degeneracy of Iranians was an important goal of the Pahlavi era modernists, and how they saw vigorous physical exercise through Western competitive sports and strength training as a way of achieving this. However, little attention has been paid to dance, and I want to shed light on that through my essay. So I will argue that Iranian modernist nationalists during the first half of the 20th century saw ballet as a way of disciplining the body of Iranian women, mostly, as a way to maintain their physical health and feminine grace, which in their eyes was a prerequisite for a progressive nation. This attitude was part and parcel of this much larger pedagogical view among Iranian modernists, where they believe physical exercise was a crucial part of building physically and mentally strong Iranians, regardless of gender and age, capable of exercising restraint, efficiency, and discipline in their daily lives. This, in turn, would assist in Iran's rapid modernization in the turn of the 20th century. This paper will argue that physical exercise for both men and women as a means of achieving national renewal, tajaddud, played a major role in Pahlavi nationalist discourse. More specifically, it will argue ballet, with its aristocratic origins, intense emphasis on bodily discipline and decorum, provided a mechanism to legitimize dance in the eyes of Iranians who for so long associated with prostitution and overt sexuality. To prove this thesis, this research will also draw from the origins of ballet in the French courts of the 17th century and compare it with pre-Pahlavi Iranian Motrebi bands in order to demonstrate why Iranian modernist nationalists saw local Iranian dance traditions as so degenerate and wanted to replace it with a more respectable ballet. Okay, so I have a lot of images to show just because you can't do a presentation on dance without, pictures of dancing movements of dance. So as I said, I started my research. Well, partly I first of all, I love ballet, and I was really inspired by the history of like ballet, where it started from, especially in France in the 17th century, under the court of in the court of Louis XIV. So basically, from the beginning, ballet was a political tool. Basically, Louis XIV in his early reign, he was embroiled in basically a civil war where the nobles rebelled against him. He defeated that rebellion, but in order to prevent it, he brought all the nobles into Versailles, the big luxurious palace that is very famous, and forced them to stay there. So in a way, he stripped them out of like their titles, not their titles, but their lands in the provinces, and brought them in Versailles so he could control them and keep a watchful eye on them. Part of the rituals in the court were dancing, and that's where ballet emerged. All the royals were expected to dance. If they didn't know how to dance, it was a huge embarrassment for them. Louis himself, he was a big dancer. He loved to dance. And basically, if you didn't know how to dance, he looked at you differently. You were no longer as respected, and you didn't retain that high position in court anymore. So there was that of controlling the bodies of nobles, literally by forcing them to know how to dance. He was keeping the nobles on their toes. So they had to like get ballet instructors, dance instructors to teach them how to dance in court rituals. As I said, Louis XIV, he was a big dancer. He wanted to use dance as basically expanding the cultural prestige of France. So basically, he made all his choreographers and his musicians and everything to basically write dance onto paper. And that's where the first positions of ballet, the first 5 positions were created. As you can see, the first position, second position, these have relatively maintained the same. And he basically notated dance with music, as you can see in a lot of these dance manuals from the 18th century that are actually in English. So he was, by putting them on paper, he was able to export it. And basically everyone wanted to copy the French fashions and the French dances. So it was a way of expanding also cultural influence in Europe. But let's go back to Iran. How was Iran during these periods when there was all those developments in Europe? So there was the Motrebi bands, which I already talked about extensively. They were amateur, I guess, in modern standards, in the sense that they weren't trained in academies and in institutions and accredited the same way that beginning in the 17th century in Europe happened, starting in France. They were traveling bands. They went to different parties, courts, and they presented mostly for the elite. These Motrebi people were generally people of lower social class, from a lower social class. And I compared that in my paper to the minstrelsy tradition in Europe that existed prior to the Renaissance. Both of these groups, they didn't have like formal official academic training. Their music, their dances were not notated. So it's really hard for us to study like the Motrebi bands because we don't know what their music was, what their dance was. There's no record of it. It wasn't put on paper the same way Europeans thought it was very important to do in the 17th century. It's really a bummer, but that's why the modernists wanted to change that. And another element is again, with modernity, the certain elements of the Motrebi traditions became problematic, like the Bacherakos. The Bacherakos was basically a boy who was underage, and he danced for adults. And why the Bacherakos, the boy Bacherakos emerged in the Motrebi tradition, especially in the late Qajar period, was because of gender segregationist policies. Boys could perform both in front of men and women, as long as the women were veiled, but vice versa, women performing in front of men was not possible. So again, this was another aspect of why the modernists beginning in the 20th century saw Iranian dance traditions as so degenerate. Here I have some more pictures. These are very interesting. You can see the Bacherakos getting quite close with these Qajar nobles and also like officials, like colonels and such. It's not really in the scope of my paper, but the Badsharaghas was very sought after, not respected, not honored as a professional dancer. They were looked as sex objects and very sought after by the Qajar nobles and officials. Not the scope of my paper, but I thought these pictures were very interesting. There's also a female Mutrebi band, but these only performed in harems, especially towards the end of the Qajar period for women. As I said, disciplined spectatorship was another element that developing the disciplined spectatorship was another thing that the modernists wanted to develop among Iranians, because it didn't exist prior to the modernization. Basically, spectatorship in Iran before that was unruly. People would, clap and dance and snap and sing along to the Mutrebi bands, throw them money, because it wasn't put on a stage. And they didn't have this form of gravitas and formality. It was part of the Shadamani celebrations of Iranian culture. In Europe, the proscenium stage, the elevated stage that has curtains, is surrounded by arch, and from the arch, the curtains are hanging, dramatically changed dance, and it elevated the performing arts as an art form. Now people had to stay silent and focus solely on the performer on stage. Being unruly, being loud was disrespectful to the performer, and besides, it distracted them from their art while performing. Here you can see the example of what the proscenium stage means. Is basically the theater that we're used to calling as, theater. You can see the pictures. So the proscenium stage, of course, led to the professionalization of the performing arts. More machinery and effects could be used on stage. Like you can see, there is like chariots and stuff on stage can be used, because from the back scenes, you could, with the help of engineers, they could do all sorts of tricks and illusions. So that's a picture of a theater in England, in London, from the 19th century. And here's a picture from, I found this cartoon from Hamid Nafisi's work on Iranian cinema, his book on the artisanal ages. I think it's the first edition, the first version of his huge volume on Iranian cinema. And it shows a theater, although it's a movie theater, but again, the same logic of a spectatorship still persists. You can see that people are unruly. There is a guy with his sheep. He's a farmer. He brought his sheep to the theater. There are people shouting and screaming. There's this woman with her baby crying, and the baby is basically urinating on the floor. You can't really see it. The quality is really bad, but that's the best I could get.
The sheep is disciplined, though.
The sheep, yeah, easily. She's disciplined, but the people are not. They're yelling, and there is that guy, the Dilnach, who has the helmet on in the middle. Yeah, he's the translator, but since everybody is so loud, he's trying to tell everyone to please be quiet and enforce discipline. But I mean, it's too much for him. And yeah, that basically shows how spectatorship before modernization was in Iran. Basically, there was no concept of it. That's why the modernists thought it so expedient to change that. On to the discourses on sport and dance, and how training the body, exercising would build a new Iranian, an Iranian that was both mentally and physically strong, and would catapult Iran to modernity. A lot has been said about the sports aspect, the physical education aspect, especially when it comes to men, but not enough. But in my research, I found that there has been, in periodicals, dance was advocated gradually, very slowly, very gradually to Iranian women, at least to practice it in their home in private settings. So as you can see, beginning in the 1930s, the dance academies started popping up, especially in, of course, Tehran, because it's the capital, and all the expats and immigrants from, Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would all come to Tehran. So it started with actually some Russian trained dancers, most notably Madame Corneli, Yelena Avedisyan, and Sarkis Janbazian, who started some of the first ballet academies in Iran. And mostly at the beginning, there were minority groups mostly went to these dance classes, people who either were Christian or they were more Western oriented, but gradually also Iranians of fully Muslim backgrounds also, started putting their girls into these dance schools in order to, cultivate that grace and discipline and, in their children, in their daughters specifically. And here's some more pictures. As you can see, the ideal Pahlavi man. I don't have a picture of the ideal Pahlavi new Iranian woman, but here you can see the new Iranian man. He's trim, he's athletic, he's this individual specifically, he's a cyclist, as compared to the Qajar man, who a lot of modernists criticize, particularly the Zurkhane, for being unhygienic, for the exercises to be medieval. In the Zurkhane, being bulky was very idealized, being big and massive. The modernists were, no, you have to be trim and, muscular and athletic and lean. So that became the ideal. The same for women. For the woman, you no longer had to be the ideal in the Qajar pictures. A lot of you may know was being plump, being voluptuous. But no, the new Pahlavi woman was fit, graceful, her muscles well-toned, defined, and ballet cultivated that. Dancing and specifically ballet cultivate that in young girls. Here I go a little bit into how ballet and the Pahlavi nationalism kind of merged together. Naila Kram Cook was the first. There were a lot of nationalist modernists who were talking about incorporating ballet into the national narrative and putting staging poetry and stories through ballet on stage. But the first one who really materialized that was Naila Kram Cook, who was an American. She was an American attaché after the Allied invasion of Iran in 1941. She was brought to Iran. She was put in the Ministry of the Interior to be a chief censor of theater and the cinema. And she did a lot to liberate the censorship that was in place from Reza Shah's government. And she created the dance troupe, started compromising of three girls. As you can see, the pictures are over there of those three girls: Haida Ahmadzadeh, Nestar Ramazani, and Vilma Petrieva. She was of Czech, but her parents lived in Iran for a long time. Basically, she used elite women of really of elite backgrounds in her troupe, just because she wanted to change that stereotype that dancing was only reserved for prostitutes or people of the demi-monde. She wanted to change that perception. She specifically used elite women's bodies to showcase these dances, and she thought why dancing was so marginalized and stigmatized in Iran, it was because it was divorced from poetry. So a lot of her choreographies, you see the pictures over there, were stories from the Shahnameh, or stories of Zoroastrian myths, or basically poetries from Hafez. Here you can see, Gorda Farid, the Gorda Farid choreography. That's Haida Ahmadzadeh. She's the dancer. Performing that's a story from the Shahnameh. So that's one of the choreographies she staged. Yeah, and that the one on top is called Prayer of Darius. That's again Haida Ahmadzadeh, again playing with these ancient pre-Islamic romantic nationalist elements to kind of, to wake up Iranians from their slumber and make them proud of their heritage. And that of course went with Pahlavi goals to glorify Iran's pre-Islamic past. As this progressed, a lot of the Pahlavi government started, she got successful. And so the Pahlavi government started funding her and funding other people, individuals, Iranian and non-Iranian dancers from abroad, choreographers from abroad, to go into the countryside in Iran and basically study the folkloric dances. The countryside, Iranians' rural regions were seen as having preserved their authenticity, their Aryan authenticity from the Arab Islamic invasion. So that's why folklore was specifically emphasized, and specifically there were stipends given to people like Robert de Warren. He was an English dancer that came to Iran, and he was he directed Iran's folkloric society, which staged a lot of these folklore, ballet/folklore dances. There was a huge, tremendous effort to stage Iran's folk dances, not only to the world, but also specifically to Iranians, to like let Iranians know that these dances exist in Iran and to be proud of it. Someone in Isfahan can see what dances are like in Baluchistan, in Kurdistan, and etc., and foster that sense of pride. That was the folklore side of it, but there was also, as I talk about, this effort to actually make ballets, like ballet plays like Swan Lake and Nutcracker. These are like part of the Western ballet repertoire, but not just present that and put it in a stage in like Rudaki Hall, but actually make like local domestic ballets and basically put stories like Bijan Armanije or the Tales of Shahzad and put them on stage. And there was huge efforts, particularly in the later Pahlavi period, to do this. One ballet of this is Bijan Armanije, choreographed by Haida Ahmadzadeh and music by Hossein Dehtavi. There is some footage on it online. It's a very grainy video, but yeah, but these efforts were happening and the pictures are there. And why are there so little record left of these dances, Bijan Armanije and like Shahzad? Well, the Iranian Revolution happened, and basically all sorts of dance was considered un-Islamic by the new regime, and basically all the resident companies at Rudaki Hall were dissolved. All the artists were dismissed, not allowed to practice their art anymore. So a lot of them had to flee, and what's worse, unfortunately, a lot of the archival records of the Rudaki Hall were destroyed. A lot of the costumes, videos of the performances, all of that was destroyed. So that's why the only video you can find on YouTube of Bijan Armanije is like very low quality, grainy video. And of course, Rudaki Hall in the duration of Iran and Iraq War was completely shut down. And when it opened in 1988, without its resident companies, which were what gave it life, it was renamed Wahdat Hall. And here you have some pictures of the Rudaki Hall and the last staff and corps de ballet of the Iranian National Ballet Company in the 1970s. So basically, to conclude, I hope that this research into the short-lived but nevertheless illustrious ballet movement in Iran and the political and intellectual undercurrents that influence its emergence will serve as an inspiration and reminder of Iran's potential for a cohesive national dance repertoire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You stole the show.
Yikes. Yikes, I'm sorry.
And questions? Yes, Mohammad.
Yeah, I had a question. So I was wondering, were there attempts made to distinguish Iranian forms of ballet and other forms of dances from Western European forms of ballet? So was there some sort of attempt for Iranians to make their form of ministerial dances and performances distinct from European ones?
There was, because officially there was the national ballet, but there was also like subdivisions of that. One was the National Folklore Society of Iran, and one was the Mahalli Dancers of Iran. So there were two, the National Ballet, which was mostly responsible for staging Western repertoire and like basically modern ballets like Bijan Armanije. Those were the responsibility of the National Ballet of Iran, but those two subdivisions I just mentioned, they were focused specifically on folkloric dances. So yeah, there was some effort to distinguish between the two, but just the mere fact of bringing Iranian folk dances on stage, they were balletifying it, if you will. Because, as I said, the spatial surroundings, like the context that these dances, these folk tribal dances happen, they weren't on stage. Like when you go to Kurdistan, like there was like a folk dance. It didn't happen on a stage. It happened in a circle, and people would join in. Just the mere fact of staging them on stage we were basically introducing ballet elements. And that's what a lot of these choreographers, both Iranian and of course non-Iranians too, because you had to bring talent from outside because there wasn't that ballet tradition in Iran before. Yes, they staged the folk dances, but at the end, they sort of had to balletize it a little bit. Just
Thank
bring it
you,
on stage.
Yasamin. Will you join me? And I want to also thank all of you individually for your outstanding presentations, and also our colleagues who have joined the session both in person and also online. Thank you very much. And I wish you all a very nice, relaxing evening. Thank you. Thank you.